She was a witty single mom who always brought the fun.
She was the spitball. She was the ball of energy.
She was definitely a jokester.
And he charmed her right off her feet.
They got so many videos of him having fun and kissing and loving on each other.
Everyone around thought that this was a match made.
However, when she's found bleeding out in a friend's apartment...
Oh my God.
He says, we need help. She needs help.
Investigators will have to sort through a web of lies to solve this case.
He confirmed that there was a second voice that he heard.
They used to be an item. They used to be in love.
And while evidence reveals a second attack...
You're not going anywhere.
He put his hands on her, which led to her then calling the police.
They said, sorry, she tried to...
Detectives may need a miracle to catch their killer.
This is a person who can calculate. He can manipulate.
The devil was in him, and he was destined to come out, and he came out on her.
April 7, 2021, Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a sunny spring day in this vibrant city known for its blend of urban sophistication and natural beauty.
Minneapolis is very diverse. It has scenic lakes, extensive parks, and a thriving art scene.
The community really helps each other. It's one of those places where everybody knows their neighbor.
But around 12:30 p.m., a 911 call comes in to Hennepin County dispatchers from a local resident named Chris Scott.
He says, there's a woman who's been injured. She's bleeding all over the place. We need help. She needs help.
Without a moment to lose, first responders rush to Chris's address, a duplex near Loring Park.
When the paramedics got to the scene, they see a woman covered in blood in very bad condition.
And as paramedics are trying to help, they're asking Chris simultaneously, who is this woman?
Yeah, that's my friend. I came in and found her like that.
He indicated that her name was Nakia Robinson.
38-year-old single mother, Nakia Robinson, had a remarkable ability to bring joy and laughter to her inner circle.
She was the spitball. She was the ball of energy. She looked much, much, much younger than she was, and then having all that energy, it could fool you.
She was definitely a jokester, but she would give you the shirt off of her back even if she didn't have another one to replace it. If you needed her, she was always there.
She was crazy about her daughters and adored them.
Whether it was out to lunch, to the mall, to buy them something, every single week she did something with her kids.
She was a wonderful mother.
Even when she was in between jobs, Nakia worked hard to make ends meet for her and her daughters.
She wanted to take care of people because she was a caring person. But in turn, she cooked for a living. She worked in restaurants and she cooked, and she actually worked at a restaurant at the Mall of America.
She was determined to provide for her girls and give them a good life.
Family was very important to her.
Then, in 2019, Nakia began dating someone who seemed to share her family-oriented values, 53-year-old Jerome Woodland.
They met through a mutual friend, and the two quickly realized they had a lot in common.
She met him just hanging out. They kind of clicked. Jerome is from Louisiana. He was in the Army, and he has a couple of children.
Jerome was divorced, and so he found himself in Minnesota creating a new life for himself.
With nearly 20 years between them, Jerome seemed to be the steady foundation Nakia was looking for.
Nakia was 38 years old, Jerome is 53, and that's a big age gap for some people.
but her kids' fathers were always older than her, and she just didn't know how to relate to men her age. She thought older men were better because they're more mature, or they have their stuff together and they can take care of her and her needs.
Be run to the stove.
Okay. And don't forget more charcoal for the grill.
I got you.
Jerome was willing to provide the love and security that Nakia yearned for.
They got so many videos of them barbecuing and hanging out and having fun and kissing and loving on each other. She was loving. She cared a lot about Jerome.
Everyone around thought that this was a match made.
But now first responders are desperately trying to keep Nakia alive as she bleeds out on the floor of her friend Chris Scott's home.
She has been stabbed in the chest, but she was clinging on to life.
After several minutes of trying to save the young mother's life, paramedics realize their efforts are too little, too late.
Nakia is pronounced dead on the scene.
Dispatch, we're gonna need homicide to my location.
Minutes later, detectives arrive to begin their investigation.
Now this is a homicide investigation, and so the homicide unit comes in.
She had about a 2-inch stab wound to the chest. And investigators also noted a very large kitchen knife on the floor next to Nakia's body. It is not uncommon for the assailant to cut themselves while attempting to stab someone else. So investigators were sure that whoever did this left evidence behind.
They were hoping to pull either fingerprints or DNA or something from that knife.
Just then, detectives find additional evidence that points to a potential motive.
They find a pipe underneath her.
They see a crack pipe, they see a bag of drugs, and they see beer cans all over the place.
It could mean that, in the space of drug activity, that something could have gone wrong.
They think there could have been some type of altercation over the use of drugs.
With her boyfriend, Jerome Woodland, by her side, 38-year-old Nakia Robinson was continuing to bring joy and laughter to those around her.
There was times where she would just do something so funny, like when everybody's laughing.
Nakia would get silly. We had a lot of fun. We could sit together and we could entertain ourselves.
But on April 7th, 2021, Nakia has been found deceased with a single stab wound to the chest, and police are trying to figure out what happened.
Nakia was located at the home of Chris Scott, who told first responders that he was a friend of hers.
And there are several troubling items inside the home.
They're finding glass pipes and other drug paraphernalia.
This doesn't look good for Chris Scott. Detectives are eager to speak with him.
After conducting their initial sweep of the crime scene, detectives question Chris.
We'll take him here, officer. Thank you. So, walk us through what happened.
Chris tells the police that around 10:30 that morning, one of his friends by the name of Jerome Woodland came over to his house.
Hey, bro, what's up?
Hey, what's up, man?
Chris says Jerome and Nakia had been in a relationship for about 2 years.
Chris tells police that he has known Jerome for a big portion of his life, maybe about 10 to 15 years. And they had lived together for one period of time, but then he recently moved in with Nakia.
Hey, Kia's coming over too, if that's cool.
Oh, yeah, cool.
About 5 minutes after Jerome arrives at Chris's home, Nakia shows up.
Hey.
Hey, babe.
Chris tells detectives that shortly after his guests arrived, he left to run an errand.
So, I gotta run out for a minute, but you all are welcome to chill here if you want.
He said, I gotta go to the doctor's appointment. You guys can stay here and hang out if you want. I'll be back in a couple hours.
But Chris says he never could have expected what he came home to.
That's when I found her. Oh my God.
Chris returned from his doctor's appointment about 12:30 in the afternoon and found Nakia on the floor with the stab wound.
He said when he was in that apartment, there was no one else there. No one else.
Jerome was nowhere to be found, so he immediately called 911.
So you haven't spoken to Jerome since?
Nah.
At this point, the police, they don't know if Jerome is a second victim. They don't know if he fled the scene.
Something seems a bit fishy about Chris's story.
Yet when they ask Chris if Jerome could be involved in Nakia's murder, he immediately shoots the idea down.
No, there is no way.
He tells them that Jerome would never hurt a fly.
So what's with all the drug paraphernalia?
Man, look, I swear, that's not mine.
Chris tells the police, well, yeah, Jerome has been known to do drugs.
Jerome was doing street hustling work for, like, I can say maybe selling drugs.
Well, we're gonna need to speak with your friend Jerome.
I can give you his number.
But when investigators try to contact Jerome, their attempts are unsuccessful.
He's not answering his phone.
Nothing.
Detectives issue an APB for Jerome, but they also have to wonder, is Chris Scott more involved in Nakia's death than he's letting on?
It seems really odd that you'd let your friend come over to do drugs while you go to a doctor's appointment. Investigators think there's more to the story.
Hello.
In their search for answers, detectives speak with the other tenant of the duplex, Chris's upstairs neighbor, Joshua Harlan.
Did you see anything suspicious earlier today?
I didn't see anything, but I did hear something.
Joshua said at 12:30 he heard some kind of commotion going on downstairs.
Josh proceeds to tell investigators that it sounded like two voices down there arguing.
He heard someone scream, "Oh God," and that he described as Chris's voice, and he heard another voice that he did not recognize.
Did the second voice sound like a male or a female?
Sounded like a male.
This bit of information immediately piques the interest of the police.
Chris told the detectives that he got back from his doctor's appointment about 12:30, and the only person that was there when he got there was Nakia.
That has investigators now wondering, was Chris telling them the truth or was he telling them a lie?
The second male voice the neighbor heard belonged to Nakia's boyfriend, Jerome Woodland.
When detectives continue speaking with Joshua, they learn there's another detail Chris left out of his statement.
Jerome and Chris aren't just friends.
Joshua goes on to tell the police Chris and Jerome, they used to be an item. They used to be in love.
When Chris Scott arrived home to find his friend's partner, Nakia Robinson, murdered in cold blood, he claimed no one else was home. Now, however, Minneapolis detectives have reason to doubt his initial statement.
Chris's neighbor, Joshua Harlan, tells police he overheard an argument between two males coming from Chris's apartment around 12:30 p.m., which is around the same time Chris said he came home and found Nakia.
As detectives continue speaking with Joshua, they learn another surprising piece of information.
Jerome and Chris aren't just friends.
Apparently, Chris used to be in a romantic relationship with Nakia's boyfriend, Jerome Woodland.
Jerome is bi. He does men and women.
Joshua goes on to tell the police, you know, that Chris and Jerome, they used to be an item. They used to be in love.
Which leads police to wonder, could Chris be covering up for his former lover?
Do we truly have a lover's triangle going on? Did Chris and Jerome do this together?
Investigators think that something is up.
So they invite Chris to come downtown and talk some more, and Chris agrees.
In an interrogation room, Chris immediately folds under the pressure.
Chris, is there anything else you need to tell us?
Okay. I wasn't being entirely truthful before.
He recanted his story.
He had a real appointment, that's all confirmed. But he said, when I walked in the door and saw her on the floor bleeding, Jerome was there.
Oh my God.
I know.
Chris maintains that he did return home at 12:30, but at that time, Jerome was standing over Nakia's body.
Man, what have you done?
It doesn't matter, man. I gotta get out of here.
No, stop. You cannot leave.
Just call 911, okay?
Oh my God.
Jerome was like, call 911, and he grabbed the phone and he said Jerome left.
But if everything Chris says is true, why did he lie to police in his initial statement?
I still have a lot of love for Jerome.
He tells them that he was in a relationship with Jerome in the past and he still had feelings for him. He didn't want him to get in trouble, and so therefore he lied.
I think Chris was scared because it happened in his house and he didn't know what was gonna come about.
After hearing Chris's revised statement, detectives are inclined to believe him.
He didn't know what happened until he came in there and saw Kia on the floor, and he was panicking.
He had nothing to do with the murder, and now the primary suspect at this time is Jerome Woodland.
Detectives know if they're going to get to the bottom of this case, they need to find Jerome. But it won't be easy.
All of the APBs that are out there throughout the state of Minnesota aren't providing any new leads as to where he could possibly be.
Jerome does have family in Louisiana, and it's very possible that he just fled.
So they subpoena different bank records as well as other information that could lead to additional discovery.
As investigators continue searching for Jerome, the tragic news of Nakia's death spreads throughout Minneapolis.
I was at home when I found out. I just dropped the phone. I lost words. I couldn't say nothing. Kia was supposed to be coming to my house that day, but she never showed up, and now I'll never talk to her again.
Renisha called to me and crying, and I said, well, what's the matter? Who died? She said, Kia. I said, stop playing. What do you mean she's gone? I just remember screaming. I couldn't think. That took all the energy. Pardon me.
And when detectives speak with Nakia's family, they reveal more unsettling information about her relationship with Jerome Woodland.
He was very moody. You never knew what version of him you were going to get.
They didn't like his anger. They didn't like the way he treated her. They just did not care for him.
He's a good guy when he's a good guy, but then he's a creep when he's a creep. He was up, he was down. One day he might be good, the next day he might be the most meanest person in the world.
According to Nakia's loved ones, Jerome's unpredictability bled into his romantic relationships as well.
Well, my mom wasn't the only woman in his life.
The family informed the police that he had been going back and forth between his ex-wife, Delilah Hayes, and Nakia.
He was two-timing them both.
While speaking with the family of murder victim Nakia Robinson, Minneapolis detectives have learned some troubling information about Nakia's relationship with her boyfriend, Jerome Woodland.
Jerome and Nakia allegedly had a pretty tumultuous relationship, partially because he was still messing around with his ex-wife on the side. He was two-timing them both.
Family and friends noticed that there were, verbal altercations that were occurring between the two.
Tensions had gotten so high that Nakia was planning to leave Jerome.
She wanted to get back with her kid's father and work things out.
Did that set Jerome off? When detectives pulled Jerome's criminal record, they find even more cause for alarm.
They find that Jerome had an assault case that happened just weeks before Nakia passed away.
The victim was his ex-wife, Delilah Hayes.
Jerome put his hands on her, which led to Delilah then calling the police and Jerome being arrested.
But then he was let out on bail.
Now, within a week of being let out of jail, his girlfriend, Nakia, is murdered.
Jerome's record raises a new concern for investigators.
They now wonder if Jerome is going to go after Delilah for this to be payback.
Is Delilah the next victim in this chain of events?
He has such a history of violence with her. They wanted to make sure she was all right, so they called her.
Thankfully, she answers.
Hello?
Yes, is this Delilah?
They asked her if she would be willing to come down for further questions, and she agrees.
Delilah starts by telling detectives that her marriage to Jerome ended when she discovered he was being unfaithful.
She found out about Nakia, and she told Jerome, hey, you can't be married to me and hanging out with somebody else. You're out of here. Goodbye.
He begged me to take him back, and I caved. And he promised me he would be faithful this time.
So now they are divorced, but they were still seeing each other.
They were trying to work on rekindling the relationship to grow and possibly move back in together.
Things looked to be on the up and up.
But I found out he was still seeing her.
Jerome's at Delilah's house, then the next minute he's at Kia's house, and it was just back and forth, back and forth. I told Kia that she deserved better and she didn't have to share a man with someone. I just didn't understand it.
It was back to square one.
When I confronted him about it, that's when he assaulted me.
Jerome put his hands on her.
And Delilah cut off all communication with Jerome shortly thereafter.
Do you have any idea where Jerome is now?
No, I haven't spoken with him since he assaulted me.
Given the clear history of abuse, detectives now wonder if Nakia's murder was the result of a cycle that spiraled out of control.
They realize they're dealing with a very dangerous person.
It continues to make it more urgent to find where he is.
Detectives will need to widen their search if they're going to have any hope of locating Jerome. But then, there's a break in the case.
One of Nakia's best friends, Renisha Johnson, comes forward.
And she has some shocking news for them.
I just wanted to let you know that Jerome called me.
At one point, Jerome was my friend as well. And I had no hate for him. I just wanted justice for her.
What did he say?
Renisha asked Jerome, why would you take Nakia away? And that's when he explained his side of the story. They were arguing about their relationship while Chris was at his doctor's appointment.
Jerome said that in the throes of the argument, he grabbed a knife, but never intended to hurt Nakia.
Like, he didn't even realize he stabbed her until he backed up, and then when he pulled away his hand, she hit the floor. That's when he said he realized that he had jabbed her. And I was just like, wow. And then he told me he watched the life leave her body, and that just blew me. Like, oh my God.
Following Jerome's confession, Renisha did everything she could to convince him to turn himself in. But he refused.
I was trying to get him to do the right thing. Just give it to God, turn yourself in.
He indicated that he would not turn himself in and that this was going to be a death by cop situation.
Which means as soon as investigators find him, Jerome will not comply to their demands.
And to be honest with you, I've been worried that he was gonna do something crazy.
Why is that?
When I spoke to the police, I told them that there's a video that he posted on Saturday, which shows intent. That Saturday is when he did the video on Wednesday when she died.
I don't know if they're gonna accept it or not, man, but you know what? My baby sister told me, God restores.
His face is scrambled when he first starts the video, so it looks like a devil. It looks like the devil's actually sitting on his shoulder.
Man, I feel like I got 53 years of just anger built up in me.
Jerome was a ticking time bomb.
And I heard something real bad.
As Minneapolis police interview Nakia Robinson's closest friends, they've learned that not only has their prime suspect, Jerome Woodland, confessed to her murder, he also posted chilling videos online in the days leading up to the crime.
For some reason, man, I feel like I got 53 years of just anger built up in me. And I heard something real bad. And I'm not really caring about the consequences.
He was creating videos that were aggressive and threatening violence onto anyone who really got in his face or messed with him in any kind of way.
I'm telling you, I'm trying to just destroy it. Man, that's the mood I'm in. You can get me, or I can get you. Man, that beast done woke up. That need to go back to sleep. That beast need to go back to sleep.
He just looked evil, so I really believe that he was possessed by something. The devil was in him, and he was destined to come out, and he came out on her.
He knew what he was gonna do. He knew his mindset.
In one of his videos, he's talking about Delilah, and he talks about how if he would have hit her a little more to the right, she would have been paralyzed.
I bet that sorry she tried that because a couple more inches, they had brain damage, man. With the wrong, bro. Tell you, I'm on construction mission.
These videos, they are indicative of someone who is violent, and it is also consistent with someone who could have murdered his girlfriend.
Who says that he done with the one person? This man walking out on the loose. He could do this to somebody else.
Now more than ever, Minneapolis investigators need to find Jerome.
Let us know if you hear from him again.
I'll walk you out. Come on. Thank you.
So, like always, the detectives tried to pull in the cell phone tower records that would have been associated and affiliated with Jerome Woodland.
They noticed that his phone stopped pinging at 1:01 p.m. on April 7th, which is the day of the murder.
That's ultimately evidence that Jerome got rid of that cell phone. Investigators could not track him.
They have no clue where he's went. He could be anywhere at this point.
This was an all-hands-on-deck manhunt. They were publishing his photos. They were letting the community know that this was an active investigation.
Every other day I was posting this picture, and I have friends all around the world. Somebody was gonna see him.
Amid declining morale, detectives turn to Jerome's Louisiana relatives.
They call up Jerome's family, and surprisingly, the family confirms that Jerome had in fact reached out to them.
He called and he said, I did something awful. I've overdone it this time.
He said he was in an argument with Nakia, and he was trying to get away from her, and something really bad happened.
Jerome's sister says no one in the family has seen or heard from him since.
He was on the run.
But on May 7th, detectives get a breakthrough in the case.
Hennepin County homicide.
Exactly 1 month to the day, police get a phone call from a man identifying himself as Jerome's attorney.
Jerome's attorney makes a phone call to let them know that he's going to turn himself in.
Later that afternoon, in front of the Minneapolis Police Department, officers prepare to detain Jerome as he and his attorney exit the vehicle.
I was relieved. I was relieved for the rest of the world. I was relieved for Nakia's daughters. I was relieved for Nakia.
He is immediately arrested on the scene.
The police are hopeful that they'll be able to get him into a room where he will talk and further incriminate himself.
However, just because he's willing to turn himself in doesn't mean he's willing to talk.
He lawyered up and turned himself in, but he never spoke to the police.
Regardless, investigators charge Jerome with Nakia's murder.
Jerome is held in jail for over a year before they can get to his actual trial.
People wanted to see justice done because that was somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, somebody's sister. She didn't deserve that.
On July 28, 2022, Jerome's trial begins inside a Hennepin County courtroom. But what his defense team proposes stuns everyone.
Jerome's defense is that Nakia's death was a complete accident, that she tripped and fell on the knife.
He was trying to come up with his storyline of why it was unintentional. He just thought he was going to get away with it.
A year after Jerome Woodland turned himself into Minneapolis police, he now stands trial for the murder of Nakia Robinson.
They offered him a plea. He didn't take it. He wanted to go to trial because he thought he was going to get off on trial.
Jerome said, no, I'm going to beat this thing.
But when Jerome's attorneys present their case, it baffles the prosecution.
Jerome Woodland is trying to frame this case as an accidental death.
According to him, they were arguing, and he told her, just leave. And she was like, I'm not going nowhere.
The way the defense explained it, she was coming towards Jerome. She was the one threatening.
So Jerome actually went and grabbed a knife out the kitchen to stop the victim from charging towards him.
I'm tired of this!
Get back!
They said he put the knife in front of him for protection, but she kept advancing towards him angrily.
He was just holding it up to defend himself from her coming at him. And according to Jerome, Nakia stumbled or tripped or something.
She ultimately, based on what the defense indicated, fell on that knife.
As that's happening, Chris enters his home.
What? Oh my God.
Just call 911, okay?
He had Chris call 911. He couldn't do it. He left the house. He didn't stay until the police got there. He said because he was high, he didn't know what to do.
He was afraid of the police. He did not want the murder to be pinned on him. And so he just reacted and left to flee the scene.
When it's the prosecution's turn, they're quick to refute the defense's claims.
The story that Nakia tripped and fell on the knife is ridiculous.
The prosecution is able to say that they know about Jerome and Nakia's relationship. I know that they had a history of back and forth arguments.
This is not his first time having any type of interaction with the court system as it relates to his behavior and his intimate partners. Delilah, Jerome's ex, had him arrested for a domestic violence incident just a week before Nakia Robinson's murder.
The prosecution believes that Jerome's violent nature reached a breaking point when he discovered Nakia was planning to leave him.
I can't do this with you anymore, Jerome.
What?
And Kia was like, well, I'm just gonna try to work it out with my kid's father, because I see that's the best thing for me. And I believe that's why he did all this.
That was his breaking point.
That's when Jerome unleashed his pent-up rage.
She decided to go back with her children's dad. He made up his mind. If he can't have her, nobody can.
To support their claims, the prosecution presents Jerome's threatening Facebook videos to the jury.
That's when I looked at Jerome and you could just see his whole demeanor drop. Like, I have the videos of him saying that he's gonna do this. This was intentional.
The Facebook videos were absolutely necessary for the jury to hear. They needed to understand who Jerome Woodland was and his propensity for violence.
And this video continues to show that this is a person who can calculate, he can manipulate, he can talk crazy. Somebody who is downright, absolutely, undeniably violent and vicious.
In summation, the prosecution states this wasn't an accident. It was a personal attack.
The medical examiner's office says that Nakia's body had about a 2-inch wound.
2 inches deep is not an accident.
He's much taller than her, so to stab her in the heart, he was waiting for her to come. He had a selfish need and a selfish thought.
Tripping would not get you the type of puncture wound that happened in her chest. The only way that could have happened was Jerome forcefully putting that knife into her chest.
I think after the fact, he really regretted it. Some type of, what have I done? But by then, you can't bring her back.
After the jury retires for deliberations, it doesn't take them long to return with a verdict.
They find Jerome guilty of the murder of Nakia Robinson.
I knew he was going to be found guilty. He told on himself, I mean, what more do you need?
I was excited. I went and bought a bottle of champagne and I celebrated me, Wahida. My kids, we celebrated. I took a shot for her. I drank a toast to justice for Kia. I was just through the roof.
However, despite Jerome's damning social media videos, the prosecution isn't able to prove premeditation in this case.
They have to do second degree. That's the highest they can do. The first degree is total premeditation. That's always hard to prove.
Jerome is sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of release or parole around the age of 74.
I wasn't gonna sleep until he got time. So I'm glad he got what he got.
I pray for a changed heart. I pray for a consciousness that will allow him to realize the damage that he done, because he's got to think about that every single day.
Trapped in her relationship, Nakia Robinson was a woman caught in an all-too-common cycle of abuse.
He definitely had the control over her that she felt like she couldn't break free from.
Nakia Robinson did not deserve what she got. She deserved to live, to see, witness, and experience the love that she had from so many family and friends.
There's a lot of women out here who think it's okay to be in these type of relationships, and it's just not.
Not everybody is loving, but hurting people hurt other people.
You deserve better. Pick what's right for you. Get out of it.
We have to pay attention to the cycles of domestic violence, and we have to ensure that those who are experiencing domestic violence have the resources necessary so that they can get out of these situations and live to tell their story.
We talk about her, and every year around that time, we do bring her to life. Might turn up, might get together and say what we miss about her.
Her kids, they don't have their mom no more, who was their best friend, who did something with them every week. It affected them deeply. But as long as I have her in my heart, I'm gonna remember her every single day.
On May 2nd, still 1992, San Francisco was moving through another evening in the strange rhythm of Chinatown, where crowded streets could become almost silent within the space of a single act, and where thousands of people could pass within yards of a place without ever knowing what had happened there. In the first block of Hang Aw Alley, inside a narrow utility corridor that had become shelter for a woman living on the margins of the city, something terrible had already happened. At approximately 6:14 p.m., officers arrived and found a woman lying on the ground. She was badly beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. And for investigators standing inside that cramped corridor, the first question was not who had killed her, but something even more basic. Who was she? The woman was eventually identified as Nancy Hernandez, 45 years old, but in those first hours, her identity was uncertain, and the circumstances surrounding her death offered almost no easy explanation. The alley was not a remote wilderness. It was in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown, surrounded by the movement of an enormous city. Yet somehow, whoever had attacked Hernandez had managed to leave behind a mystery that would survive for more than 3 decades. The case would become what investigators call a cold case, a homicide that refuses to disappear even when the trail seems to have gone cold. Years would pass. Detectives would change. Technology would transform. Evidence that once seemed silent would eventually speak. But in 1992, none of that was visible. There was only the scene, the victim, and an unknown person who had vanished into a city of millions. The San Francisco office of the chief medical examiner determined that Hernandez had suffered severe violence and died from strangulation. During the examination, investigators collected swabs to determine whether she had been sexually assaulted. Those samples would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case, although nobody could have known that at the time. In the early stages, detectives Harry Walwyn and Ora Ginther investigated the homicide. They were faced with the brutal reality of a killing in which the victim had been attacked in a vulnerable location and the perpetrator was nowhere to be found. There was no arrest, no courtroom, no definitive name attached to the crime. The investigation continued, but the years began to change the case. Evidence could be preserved, but memories could fade. Witnesses could disappear. Investigators could retire. A homicide could move from the urgency of a fresh crime to the quiet shelves of an unresolved file. Yet Nancy Hernandez had not disappeared from the official record. Her name remained connected to a case number. Her death remained a fact. Her killer remained unidentified. In 2005, 13 years after the murder, Inspector Kervin Silas submitted the sexual assault evidence collected from the case to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. That decision mattered because forensic science was changing rapidly. DNA evidence was becoming one of the most powerful tools available to investigators, capable of distinguishing one person from another with extraordinary precision. But a DNA profile is only useful if investigators can connect it to a person. A sample can sit inside a laboratory. It can be preserved. It can be tested. It can generate a profile. Yet, if the profile has no name attached to it, the mystery remains. For years, that was the position of the Hernandez case. The evidence existed. The answer did not. And then the calendar moved on. 1992 became 1993, then 1994, then 1995. A decade passed. Then another. San Francisco changed around the case. Chinatown changed. Police technology changed. The people who had first investigated the killing grew older. Some eventually moved on from the department. But the murder remained frozen in time. Nancy Hernandez had been dead for years, but the question of who killed her had never received a final answer. By the time the 21st century was well underway, the case belonged to a different era of criminal investigation. The original detectives had worked without the digital systems investigators now take for granted. There was no modern DNA database capable of instantly comparing an unknown profile against millions of records. There was no guarantee that a biological sample from a 1992 crime scene could identify a suspect decades later. But there was something else. evidence that had survived. The samples connected to the sexual assault remained part of the investigative record. And in cold case investigations, survival can be everything. A case does not always need a new witness. Sometimes it needs only an old piece of evidence examined through a new lens. That possibility became increasingly important as the San Francisco Police Department's Homicide Cold Case Unit returned to unresolved killings. On October 11th, SIL 2023, investigators formally reopened the Hernandez investigation. More than 31 years had passed since her death. The world that existed on the night of May 2nd, SIL 1992, was almost unrecognizable compared with the world investigators were now entering. Technology had advanced. Databases had expanded. DNA analysis had become routine in major investigations. And the question confronting detectives was no longer simply what happened to Nancy Hernandez. It was whether the evidence collected after her death could finally identify the person responsible. The crime lab examined the available DNA profiles and entered them into the FBI's combined DNA index system known as CODE. The process was not cinematic in the way a dramatic confession might be. There was no suspect walking through a door, no anonymous caller suddenly revealing a secret. Instead, there was data, a biological profile, a database, a comparison, and then, after decades of silence, a match. The profile was associated with a man named Ricky Dawson. According to police, Dawson was already connected to other sexual assault homicides in different parts of the United States. He was not a man who appeared from nowhere. His name was already present in other investigations. He was serving a sentence in Colorado and was involved in another murder case there. Suddenly, the 1992 killing in San Francisco was no longer an isolated mystery. Investigators had a name. They had a DNA connection, and they had a suspect who was already behind bars. But a DNA match is not the same thing as a conviction. It is evidence. It is a lead. It is a potential bridge between a victim and a suspect. But the legal system still requires proof beyond the accusation itself. On January 2nd, SIL 2025, San Francisco authorities issued an arrest warrant for Dawson in connection with Nancy Hernandez's death. The warrant was sent to the Denver Sheriff's Office, and a hold was placed on him. The case that had remained unresolved since 1992 had suddenly moved again after 33 years. The name of a potential suspect was no longer hidden inside an unidentified file. It was attached to an active investigation. The significance of that moment was difficult to measure. For more than 3 decades, Nancy Hernandez's murder had existed as an unanswered question. Now, investigators believed that biological evidence had provided a connection that earlier generations of detectives could not obtain. But there was another layer to the story, one that made the discovery even more disturbing. Dawson had been linked to other sexual assault killings in different cities and states, according to authorities. The San Francisco investigation, therefore, opened a much larger question. Was the 1992 Chinatown homicide part of a broader pattern? Police said Dawson had been linked to killings involving sexual assault in Panama City Beach, Florida, Seattle, Washington, and Denver, Colorado. Those connections did not automatically prove that he was responsible for Nancy Hernandez's death. Each case had to stand on its own evidence. But for investigators looking at a murder that had resisted resolution for 33 years, the overlap was impossible to ignore. The old case file was no longer simply about a woman found dead in a Chinatown alley. It had become a potential link in a much larger chain of violence. And yet Nancy Hernandez remained at the center of it. Before the DNA, before the databases, before the warrant, before the headlines returned, she had been a 45-year-old woman living without the security that many people take for granted. Her shelter was a utility corridor in an alley. Her death might have happened in one of the most densely populated areas of San Francisco, but the identity of her killer remained hidden for decades. That contradiction is what makes cold cases so haunting. A person can die surrounded by millions and still leave behind a mystery that takes a generation to solve. The city continued. Buildings change. Streets are repaved. People move away. New families arrive. New crimes occupy the headlines. But somewhere inside a police archive, a name remains. Somewhere inside a laboratory, a sample waits. Somewhere inside a database, a profile waits for another profile to appear. For Nancy Hernandez, that moment did eventually come. 33 years after her death, investigators believed the silence had finally been broken. But even then, the story was not finished. A suspect had been identified. A warrant had been issued. The evidence had produced a connection, yet the courtroom had not delivered a verdict. And the question that had haunted San Francisco since that evening in 1992 had changed shape. It was no longer simply, who killed Nancy Hernandez? Now it was something far more immediate, far more dangerous, and far more difficult to answer. What happened in that alley, and could the evidence preserved for more than 3 decades finally prove who was responsible? The answer to a 33-year-old murder was no longer buried only in an old police file. It was sitting inside a biological sample preserved from a crime committed in San Francisco in 1992, waiting for technology to catch up with the evidence. But identifying a possible suspect was only the beginning, because behind every cold case breakthrough is a second battle, one that is less dramatic than the moment a database produces a name, but far more important to a courtroom, proving what that name means. When investigators reopened Nancy Hernandez's case in October 2023, they were not simply looking at a crime scene from another era. They were rebuilding an investigation that had begun more than 3 decades earlier, piece by piece, asking what the original detectives had known, what they had collected, what had been preserved, and what modern forensic science could now reveal. The case had been dormant, but the evidence had not necessarily been dead. The sexual assault examination conducted after Hernandez's death had produced biological material that could potentially contain the genetic signature of the person who assaulted her. In 2005, Inspector Kervin Silas had submitted that evidence to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. The technology available at the time was already powerful compared with what investigators had possessed in 1992, but even then, forensic DNA was only useful if the resulting profile could be connected to an individual. For years, the profile remained without a confirmed identity. That was the cruel mathematics of a cold case. Investigators could possess the answer in microscopic form and still have no way to read it. A DNA profile could tell them that a biological contributor existed, but it could not simply announce a name. The profile needed a comparison. It needed another piece of the puzzle, and the longer the case remained unresolved, the more distant the possibility of that comparison seemed. Then the case was reopened. Detectives began examining the evidence again, and the crime lab entered the available DNA profiles into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. This was not the first time the evidence had been tested. That distinction matters. The crucial change was not necessarily that investigators suddenly discovered DNA where none had existed before. The evidence had been collected years earlier. What changed was the ability to compare that evidence against an expanding network of criminal justice records. Modern cold case investigations often depend on this principle. The evidence remains the same, but the world around the evidence changes. A person who could not be identified in 2005 may become identifiable years later because a new DNA record enters a database. A person who was once unknown may become known because of an unrelated arrest, conviction, or forensic submission. That is what happened in the Hernandez investigation, according to San Francisco police. The DNA profile connected to the 1992 sexual assault produced a match associated with Ricky Dawson. Suddenly, a name entered a case that had been defined for decades by the absence of one. Investigators now had to determine whether the genetic connection could withstand scrutiny and whether other evidence supported the conclusion that Dawson was responsible for the death of Nancy Hernandez. The discovery was striking not only because of the age of the case, but because Dawson was not living as an unidentified man beyond the reach of law enforcement. He was already incarcerated in Colorado. Authorities said he was serving a sentence there and was also facing another murder case. The possibility that the person connected by DNA to Hernandez's case was already behind bars transformed the investigation. Detectives did not have to locate a suspect who had disappeared into society. They had to build a case against a man whose identity was already established and whose history was already under scrutiny elsewhere. But that did not make the case simple. If anything, it raised new questions. How had Dawson's DNA entered law enforcement databases? What was the nature of the connection between the biological evidence and the suspect? Could investigators establish that the DNA belonged to the person who committed the crime rather than merely someone whose biological material appeared in circumstances unrelated to the homicide? What additional evidence existed from 1992? What had witnesses remembered? What did the original investigation reveal? And what could still be reconstructed after more than 30 years? These questions became central as detectives moved from identification toward prosecution. On January 2nd, SIL 2025, authorities issued an arrest warrant for Dawson in connection with Hernandez's homicide. A hold was placed on him through the Denver Sheriff's Office. The language surrounding the case was careful because the legal distinction was critical. Dawson was a suspect, not a convicted killer in the Hernandez case. Police could announce the forensic breakthrough, but only a court could determine guilt. For the Hernandez family and those who had followed the case, however, the warrant represented something that had not existed for decades: movement. A case that had spent years standing still was suddenly advancing. The passage of time had created enormous obstacles, but it had also created an unexpected advantage. The science of DNA had become dramatically more sophisticated, databases had grown. Investigators had more sophisticated methods for searching and comparing genetic evidence, and a sample that had once seemed incapable of producing an answer could suddenly become the central piece of a homicide investigation. Yet the story of Nancy Hernandez was not simply about technology. It was also about what happens when a victim becomes a file number in the memory of a city. In 1992, investigators had responded to Hang Aw Alley after receiving a report of a woman lying on the ground. They found Hernandez severely beaten and sexually assaulted. The medical examiner determined that she died from strangulation. Those facts were devastatingly direct. There was no ambiguity about the violence inflicted upon her. The mystery was the identity of the person who had carried it out. The original detectives, Harry Walwyn and Ora Ginther, worked the case in an era before today's forensic capabilities. They gathered evidence. They searched for answers. They followed whatever leads were available, but the investigation did not produce an arrest. Years later, the case would be revisited by other investigators, including Inspector Kervin Silas, who submitted the preserved sexual assault evidence for laboratory analysis in 2005. That decision became increasingly significant as technology advanced. The sample was not merely a relic from a forgotten investigation. It was a time capsule. It contained biological information capable of surviving long after memories had deteriorated. It could outlast careers. It could outlast police administration. It could outlast the assumptions of investigators who had once believed that the killer might never be identified. And eventually, that biological evidence reached a database that could provide the comparison investigators had been waiting for. The match to Dawson also raised a disturbing possibility. According to authorities, Dawson had been linked to other sexual assault homicides in Florida, Washington, and Colorado. These cases were separate investigations, and the existence of connections elsewhere did not establish guilt in Hernandez's death. But investigators were suddenly looking at the possibility that the 1992 killing belonged to a broader pattern. That possibility made the old San Francisco case even more significant. A murder that had once appeared isolated might have been connected to a man whose name had surfaced in other violent investigations. The passage of time had concealed that possibility. DNA had brought it back into focus. But cold case investigations are rarely solved by a single dramatic revelation. The more common reality is slow. Detectives must reconstruct timelines. They must examine old reports. They must determine what evidence was collected and how it was handled. They must confirm the integrity of forensic tests. They must establish connections between physical evidence and the circumstances of the crime. They must anticipate challenges from the defense. And they must do all of this while confronting the greatest enemy in an old homicide: time. 33 years can erase an extraordinary amount of information. A witness who was 25 in 1992 might be nearly 60 today. A person who saw something unusual may no longer remember the details. Someone who once lived near Hang Aw Alley may have moved to another state or another country. Businesses may have changed owners. Surveillance cameras that today might record an entire street did not exist in the same ubiquitous form. Digital location records were not available to reconstruct movements. The investigators working the case had to depend on what remained: paper, photographs, laboratory results, statements, memories, and DNA. This is what makes the Hernandez case so striking. The central forensic clue did not arrive through a modern crime scene. It came from the past. The biological evidence had already been there. The breakthrough came because investigators returned to it. That decision demonstrates why cold cases can remain alive even when they appear forgotten. A case can sit unresolved for decades and still contain evidence capable of changing everything. The difference between an unsolved homicide and a solvable homicide may be nothing more than the technology available at the moment someone decides to look again. For Hernandez, that second look came more than 30 years after her death, but the investigation now entered an entirely different phase. The question was no longer whether detectives could identify a potential suspect. They had one. The question was whether they could transform a DNA match and the surviving evidence into a case that could withstand the demands of the justice system. And while investigators continued building that case, the man they believed was connected to Hernandez's death remained incarcerated in Colorado, separated from the San Francisco alley where the killing had occurred by more than 1,000 miles and more than 3 decades. Somewhere between those 2 points in time and geography was the truth of what happened to Nancy Hernandez. The DNA had created a bridge. Now investigators had to determine whether that bridge could carry the full weight of the case. For 33 years, the murder of Nancy Hernandez had existed in the space between certainty and silence. A crime with a known victim, a documented cause of death, preserved forensic evidence, and yet no person formally held responsible for what happened inside that narrow San Francisco alley. The DNA match changed the direction of the investigation, but it did not erase the years between 1992 and 2025. Those years mattered because a cold case is never simply an old case. It is an investigation forced to operate against the erosion of time. Every surviving document becomes more important. Every laboratory result becomes more valuable. Every remembered detail becomes more fragile. And every forensic connection must be examined with extraordinary care. When San Francisco detectives returned to Nancy Hernandez, they were effectively stepping into an investigation begun by people working under very different circumstances. The original detectives, Harry Walwyn and Ora Ginther, had investigated the homicide in the aftermath of the discovery in Hang Aw Alley. They knew the crime as something immediate and physical. They were dealing with a recently deceased woman, a violent scene, and a community that had just learned that a person had been killed in its midst. Their work began without the benefit of the technology available to investigators decades later, yet they collected evidence, documented the scene, and established the basic facts that would eventually allow future investigators to reopen the case. Hernandez was 45 years old. Her death was violent. The medical examiner determined that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Those facts became the foundation upon which every later investigator would build. The sexual assault evidence was especially important because biological material can preserve information about an offender long after other clues disappear. In 1992, however, that material could not simply produce an identity. Even as DNA technology advanced, investigators still needed a comparison. By 2005, Inspector Kervin Silas recognized the potential significance of the evidence and submitted the sexual assault samples to the San Francisco Police Department crime lab. The decision meant that the case was no longer dependent entirely on memories from the early 1990s. It now contained a forensic profile that could potentially be compared against future records. But the first years after that submission did not bring the breakthrough investigators wanted. A profile without a matching identity remained an unresolved clue. It was as if investigators had obtained the fingerprint of an invisible person but had no database entry against which to compare it. That changed as criminal DNA databases expanded. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies were increasingly able to compare genetic profiles collected in one investigation against profiles connected to entirely different crimes. A suspect who had never been considered in a particular case could suddenly become relevant because his DNA had entered the system for another reason. This is one of the defining features of modern cold case investigations. The victim does not necessarily receive a new clue from the original crime scene. Instead, the clue may come from a completely different place years later. In Hernandez's case, investigators said the DNA profile connected to the sexual assault eventually matched Ricky Dawson. The match did not come with a confession. It did not come from a witness suddenly remembering his face. It came from forensic comparison. And that distinction made the development both powerful and complicated. DNA could place a person into the investigative picture, but detectives still had to establish the circumstances surrounding that DNA. They had to determine what the biological evidence meant in the context of the crime and whether it could support the broader allegation that Dawson was responsible for Hernandez's death. The case had now entered a period in which forensic science and traditional police work had to operate together. Detectives needed to understand the original evidence while also examining Dawson's known history. Authorities said Dawson was already incarcerated in Colorado and had been linked to other sexual assault homicides. That information was significant to investigators because it created a possible pattern, but legally each case remained distinct. One accusation could not automatically prove another. One DNA association could not replace the need for a complete investigation. The challenge was therefore to take the forensic discovery and reconstruct the story around it. Where was Hernandez killed? What was known about the circumstances? What evidence survived? What had investigators learned in 1992? What had changed by the time the case was reopened? And what could be independently established about Dawson? The passage of time made those questions harder. The city of San Francisco in 2025 was not the city investigators knew in 1992. Neighborhoods had changed. Technology had changed. The way police processed evidence had changed. Even the language surrounding forensic investigation had evolved. But the physical evidence from the original case remained connected to the same victim. That continuity gave investigators something rare in a decades-old homicide. A piece of the past that could still be scientifically examined. The DNA evidence had survived the years, but the investigation still had to account for how it had been collected and preserved. For a prosecutor, forensic evidence is only as useful as its reliability and its ability to withstand scrutiny. Defense attorneys can challenge how evidence was handled, how testing was conducted, what a match actually proves, and whether there are alternative explanations. Therefore, investigators working a cold case must often do more than solve the mystery for themselves. They must build a record capable of explaining the mystery to a juror. That meant the Hernandez investigation had to move beyond the dramatic revelation of Dawson's identity. The DNA match was the moment that changed the case, but it was not the end of the process. In January 2025, San Francisco authorities issued an arrest warrant for Dawson. The warrant was sent to the Denver Sheriff's Office where Dawson was already being held. A hold was placed on him. The significance was immediate. After decades without an identified suspect in the Hernandez homicide, authorities had now taken a formal legal step. The cold case was moving from the investigative stage toward prosecution. But even that transition came with a crucial limitation. A warrant is not a verdict. An arrest is not a conviction. A suspect can be accused and still remain legally presumed innocent until proven guilty. That distinction is especially important in a case surrounded by sensational details because the public naturally wants the mystery to end the moment a suspect is named. Cold cases, however, do not end when a name appears. They enter another stage. Investigators must prove the connection. Prosecutors must evaluate the evidence. Courts must determine whether the evidence can be admitted. And ultimately, if the case reaches trial, a jury must decide whether the prosecution has proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For Nancy Hernandez, that meant the DNA breakthrough was both an ending and a beginning. The 33-year silence had been interrupted, but the final answer had not yet been delivered by a court. Meanwhile, investigators were confronted with another extraordinary element of the case: Dawson's alleged connections to other violent crimes. Authorities said he had been linked to sexual assault homicides in Panama City Beach, Florida, Seattle, Washington, and Denver, Colorado. These connections drew attention because they suggested that investigators were not dealing with a completely isolated allegation, But the existence of other cases also introduced complexity. Detectives had to separate confirmed facts from investigative theories. They had to avoid assuming that because a person was accused or convicted elsewhere, he must automatically be responsible for every similar crime. The Hernandez case had to stand on its own evidence. That principle became particularly important as the investigation moved toward the courts. The public might see a pattern. Detectives might see a pattern. Prosecutors might see a possible pattern, but a courtroom requires evidence tied directly to the specific charge, and that brought the story back to the DNA collected after Hernandez's. The sample had become the central thread connecting the past to the present. Without it, investigators might still have had a 33-year-old homicide with no identified suspect. With it, they had a forensic connection to a named individual. The technology had not traveled backward through time. The laboratory had not somehow recreated the crime. Instead, the evidence had waited. It had remained preserved while everything around it changed. The killer, whoever he was, could have disappeared from the memories of witnesses. The city could have moved on. The original investigators could have retired. But the genetic information remained, and eventually the database produced the connection. This is why cold case investigations can be so unsettling. They reveal that time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it creates the conditions for evidence to become more powerful. In 1992, DNA was a developing forensic tool. In the decades that followed, it became increasingly central to homicide investigations. A sample that once provided limited information could eventually become a direct investigative lead. For Nancy Hernandez, the significance was enormous. Her death had not been forgotten by the system, even if the case had disappeared from daily headlines. Somewhere, someone had kept the evidence. Someone had submitted it for testing. Someone had preserved the records. Someone had decided that a case more than 30 years old was still worth reopening, and when investigators finally received the match they had been waiting for, the old homicide suddenly became current again. But the most haunting question remained unanswered in the public mind. If the DNA connected Dawson to the sexual assault evidence, what exactly happened during those final moments in Hang Ah Alley? Did the evidence reveal the entire sequence of events, or only one part of it? What other details could still be recovered from the original investigation? And how much of the truth had disappeared forever with the passage of 33 years? Those questions now carried a different weight because there was a suspect. For decades, Nancy Hernandez, killer, had been a faceless figure. Now investigators believed they knew who that person might be. The challenge was to prove it. And as the case moved forward, the distance between a forensic match and a courtroom conviction became the next battlefield in a homicide that had already survived 3 decades of silence. The name Ricky Dawson had changed the Hernandez investigation, but it had not changed the past. Nancy Hernandez was still dead. Hang Ah Alley was still the place where investigators had found her. The violence documented by the medical examiner was still the reality of what had happened in 1992, and the DNA evidence, despite its enormous significance, could not tell investigators everything. It could connect biological material to a person. It could open a door. It could transform a forgotten file into an active homicide investigation. But behind that scientific connection was a question that detectives had to reconstruct the hard way. What happened before, during, and after the attack on Nancy Hernandez? The answer could not simply be read from a laboratory report. It required investigators to return to the original evidence and examine the circumstances surrounding it with modern eyes. That meant going back to the beginning, back to the evening when officers were called to Hang Ah Alley and discovered a woman lying on the ground. The location itself was significant. Chinatown is one of San Francisco's most recognizable neighborhoods, dense with buildings, businesses, pedestrians, narrow streets, and passages that can feel isolated despite being surrounded by urban life. Hang Ah Alley was not some distant wilderness where a body could remain hidden indefinitely. It existed inside a neighborhood where people lived and worked. Yet the person responsible for Hernandez's death had managed to carry out a brutal assault without leaving investigators with an immediately identifiable suspect. That contradiction became part of the mystery. How could such violence occur in a populated area and still produce a case that remained unresolved for decades? In 1992, investigators had to work with what the scene could provide. There were no modern networks of street cameras capable of reconstructing movements minute by minute. There were no smartphones producing automatic location records. There was no enormous digital ecosystem storing the movements of people who passed through the area. Detectives depended heavily on physical evidence, witness accounts, photographs, reports, and traditional investigative method. Every detail had to be discovered manually. Every possible witness had to be located and interviewed. Every piece of evidence had to be collected and preserved. The investigation was a race against time from the moment it began, because investigators understood that people forget and evidence can disappear. Yet one piece of evidence would survive longer than almost everything else: the biological material collected during the sexual assault examination. That evidence would become the bridge between 1992 and the eventual identification of Dawson. The medical examiner's findings established that Hernandez had suffered multiple forms of violence. She had been beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The final cause of death was strangulation. These findings transformed the case from an unexplained death into a homicide investigation with a clear indication of extreme violence. The investigators had to determine whether the person responsible had been known to Hernandez, whether the attack was opportunistic, whether there was a connection to the location, and whether any witnesses had seen something unusual before or after the killing. But the further investigators moved away from the immediate crime scene, the more uncertain the answers became. In a cold case, uncertainty accumulates. One missing witness creates one gap. One forgotten detail creates another. One unanswered question becomes connected to another unanswered question. Eventually, investigators can have a file full of information while still lacking the single fact that matters most: the identity of the offender. That was the position the Hernandez case eventually reached. The case did not disappear because police stopped caring. It disappeared from the headlines because there was no dramatic development. There was no arrest to report, no trial to follow, no confession to broadcast. The case became part of the enormous collection of unresolved homicides that law enforcement agencies carry from one generation to another. But the evidence remained. And in 2005, Inspector Kervin Silas submitted the sexual assault evidence to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. The decision demonstrated that the case still had investigative value. Modern forensic testing could potentially reveal information that investigators in 1992 could not obtain. The laboratory produced a DNA profile, but the profile did not immediately provide an identity. This was a critical stage in the history of the case because it showed both the power and limitation of DNA. People sometimes imagine forensic DNA as a magic key that instantly reveals a perpetrator. In reality, DNA generally tells investigators who contributed biological material, but identifying that person requires comparison. If the person's profile is not already in an accessible database, the laboratory may have no name to attach to the result. The evidence can be scientifically strong and still leave investigators with an unanswered question. That was what happened for years. The profile existed, but the person behind it remained unidentified. Then the world changed again. DNA databases expanded. Law enforcement agencies became more capable of sharing forensic information. Cold case units increasingly returned to old evidence because a sample that produced no match years earlier might produce one today. The Hernandez investigation eventually benefited from exactly that principle. When detectives reopened the case in October 2023, they were entering an investigation that had already survived more than 3 decades. The cold case team reviewed the existing evidence and worked with the crime lab to compare the available DNA profiles through CODIS. The result was the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for years. The profile was associated with Ricky Dawson. For detectives, this was the moment when the old investigation suddenly acquired a new direction. For the public, it was the moment when a forgotten murder returned to the headlines. But investigators knew that identification was only one part of the process. The next step was establishing the suspect's relationship to the evidence and to the crime. Dawson's location and criminal history became important areas of investigation. Authorities said he was already incarcerated in Colorado and was connected to other sexual assault homicide investigations. His incarceration meant that investigators were not searching for a fugitive moving freely through the city. Instead, they had a suspect already under the control of another jurisdiction. That situation could make the logistics of the investigation easier, but it did not eliminate the legal complexities. San Francisco authorities still needed to pursue their own case. They needed to establish jurisdictional procedures. They needed to coordinate with authorities in Colorado. They needed to secure the arrest process. And they needed to make sure that the evidence supporting the allegation was properly documented. On January 2nd, SIL 2025, an arrest warrant was issued for Dawson in connection with Hernandez's homicide. The Denver Sheriff's Office received the warrant, and a hold was placed on him. For the first time since 1992, the Hernandez homicide had an identified suspect facing formal action, yet the case was still not finished. The passage of time meant that every investigative decision could be challenged. The defense could question the reliability of old evidence. It could examine how the DNA sample had been handled over the years. It could scrutinize laboratory methods. It could question whether the biological connection established that Dawson committed the homicide itself. And prosecutors would have to answer those challenges with evidence rather than emotion. The public might look at the DNA match and see a solution. The courtroom would demand more. That distinction is essential in any true crime case, but especially in a case more than 30 years old. A cold case can be emotionally compelling because the passage of time creates the impression that every new clue must be definitive, but investigators cannot afford that assumption. A forensic match must be interpreted within the full context of the evidence. The identity of the DNA contributor is one question. The circumstances under which that biological material was deposited are another. The connection between the contributor and the victim is another. The connection between the contributor and the act that caused death is another. And ultimately, the question of legal guilt is decided by the justice system. For Nancy Hernandez, the forensic evidence provided something that had been missing since 1992, direction. The investigation could now move forward with a specific individual at its center. Detectives could examine Dawson's known history. They could compare timelines. They could look for additional evidence. They could coordinate with investigators from other jurisdictions. They could revisit records that might once have seemed unrelated. The case was no longer a mystery with no name attached. It was an active investigation involving a named suspect and a powerful forensic connection. But there was another reason the case drew attention. The authorities' description of Dawson's alleged links to other sexual assault homicides suggested that the Hernandez investigation might not exist in isolation. Police said he had been linked to cases in Panama City Beach, Seattle, and Denver. If those connections were ultimately established through admissible evidence, they could provide investigators with a broader understanding of Dawson's movements and history. But again, every case had to be separated from the other. Similar allegations do not prove identity. A suspect's history cannot replace evidence in the specific homicide being prosecuted. The Hernandez case remained its own case, and that meant returning to the evidence collected in that San Francisco alley more than 30 years earlier. The old photographs, the original report, the medical examiner's findings, the sexual assault samples, the DNA profile, the investigative notes. The pieces had been scattered across time, but together they formed the only surviving pathway back to the truth. The most remarkable part was that the pathway had never completely disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone to follow it again. In 1992, investigators could not know that biological evidence collected from Hernandez would eventually identify a suspect decades later. They could not know that the man associated with the profile would already be incarcerated in another state. They could not know that a future cold case unit would reopen the investigation. They could not know that a DNA database would eventually connect the evidence to a name. All they could do was preserve what they found. That decision became crucial because when the case was reopened, the evidence was still there. The city had changed. The detectives had changed. The technology had changed. But the biological evidence had remained. And now, after 33 years, it had brought investigators to Ricky Dawson, The mystery had finally acquired a face, but the most difficult question was still waiting behind that face. Could investigators prove, beyond the DNA connection, that the man now identified had been responsible for the death of Nancy Hernandez on that long-ago evening in San Francisco? The investigation had reached the point every cold case detective waits for, but also the point where mistakes become dangerous. After more than 3 decades, investigators finally had a name connected to the biological evidence from Nancy Hernandez's sexual assault examination. Ricky Dawson was no longer simply an unknown figure somewhere beyond the reach of the case. According to San Francisco authorities, the DNA profile associated with the evidence matched him. Yet the moment a name enters a homicide investigation, the standard of proof becomes more demanding, not less. Detectives must separate what they know from what they suspect. They must distinguish a forensic fact from an investigative theory. They must determine what the evidence can actually prove, and they must reconstruct a crime committed in 1992 with records created by people who could never have imagined that those records would still matter 33 years later. That reconstruction began with the evidence itself. The sexual assault samples collected after Hernandez's death were among the most important surviving elements of the investigation. They had been gathered in the immediate aftermath of the killing, long before anyone knew that DNA would eventually become the key to the case. When Inspector Kervin Silas submitted those samples to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab in 2005, the purpose was straightforward: determine whether modern forensic analysis could identify the person responsible. The laboratory was able to generate a DNA profile, but the profile initially remained unidentified. The result was significant, but incomplete. Investigators knew they had genetic information connected to the assault, yet they did not have a name. For years, that was the boundary of what the science could provide. Then technology and databases evolved. By the time the homicide was reopened in October 2023, investigators could approach the evidence differently. The San Francisco Police Department's Homicide Cold Case Unit worked with the crime lab, and the DNA profiles were entered into CODIS. That comparison produced the connection to Dawson. It was a breakthrough because the evidence had finally crossed the line from anonymous biological material to an identifiable individual. But detectives still had to understand the significance of that connection. DNA can be extraordinarily powerful, but investigators must always consider context. The presence of a person's biological material does not automatically explain how or when it was deposited. In a sexual assault investigation, however, biological evidence can carry enormous evidentiary weight, particularly when it is recovered from forensic samples collected directly after the alleged assault. The Hernandez case therefore presented prosecutors with a forensic connection that had been preserved from the original investigation. The challenge was to establish the chain between the evidence, Dawson, Hernandez, and the homicide. The more investigators examined Dawson's background, the more complicated the story became. Authorities said Dawson was already incarcerated in Colorado and had been linked to other sexual assault homicide investigations. That information drew attention because it suggested that his name was not appearing in San Francisco in isolation. Investigators in other jurisdictions had encountered him in connection with violent cases, but the existence of other investigations did not automatically establish responsibility for Hernandez's murder. Each case required independent proof. The law does not allow a person to be convicted of one homicide simply because investigators believe he committed another. The Hernandez case, therefore, had to be built around the evidence connected specifically to Nancy Hernandez. That meant returning again and again to the original crime. On May 2nd, still 1992, officers had found Hernandez in the first block of Hangar Alley. The medical examiner determined that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Those findings established a violent sequence, but they did not identify the attacker. The location offered investigators a physical starting point, but not an obvious ending. The alley was surrounded by the dense environment of Chinatown, yet the investigation did not immediately produce a suspect. The case remained unresolved through the years when the city changed around it. People who had lived nearby moved away. Others died. Memories faded. Investigators who had worked the original case moved into different assignments or eventually left the department. But the evidence remained part of the record. The case was never erased. That distinction matters because a cold case can appear dormant while investigators continue to preserve the possibility of future progress. In the Hernandez investigation, that possibility depended heavily on the biological evidence. Without the DNA, the case might still have been an unidentified homicide. With it, detectives had a path forward. The January 2025 arrest warrant represented the first major legal consequence of that path. Authorities issued the warrant for Dawson and sent it to the Denver Sheriff's Office, where he was already being held. A hold was placed on him. The action did not mean the case was over. It meant the investigative theory had advanced far enough for authorities to seek formal legal proceedings. That distinction is critical. Police can believe they have identified a suspect. Prosecutors can believe the evidence is sufficient to pursue charges, but the courts must still evaluate the case under established legal standards. And in a homicide more than 30 years old, those standards become particularly important because the defense can point to the extraordinary passage of time. 33 years creates questions about evidence preservation, witness memory, investigative methods, and the circumstances under which old evidence was collected. The prosecution must be able to explain why the evidence remains reliable. It must demonstrate how the DNA profile was obtained. It must establish how the profile was compared. It must show why investigators believe the connection is relevant to the homicide. And if the case proceeds to trial, the defense will have the opportunity to challenge those conclusions. That is the difference between solving a mystery and proving a crime. Detectives can reach a compelling answer through investigation. A courtroom requires admissible evidence. For Nancy Hernandez, that distinction was about to become central. The public had waited more than 3 decades for the possibility of an answer. But justice could not be measured by how satisfying that answer appeared in a headline. It had to be measured by evidence. The DNA breakthrough was therefore both powerful and incomplete. It answered one question: who was associated with the biological evidence? It did not, by itself, narrate the entire night of May 2nd, Sill, 1992. It did not describe every movement inside Hang Ah Alley. It did not explain the motive. It did not reveal what the attacker was thinking. It did not tell investigators what happened before the assault or what happened immediately afterward. Those details, if they could still be established, had to come from the remaining evidence and the reconstruction of the case. This is where the old investigative files became important. Every report written in 1992 represented a piece of the original understanding of the crime. Every photograph preserved an image of the scene before time altered it. Every forensic record documented something investigators had found before the case became cold. Every interview contained memories captured at a moment when the event was still fresh. In a modern cold case investigation, these records can become almost archaeological. Detectives are not simply investigating the crime. They are investigating the investigation itself. They must determine what the original detectives knew, what they missed, what was impossible to determine at the time, and what modern technology can now reveal. The Hernandez case demonstrated the importance of that process. The DNA profile had been generated years before the case was reopened, but the profile became meaningful only when investigators could connect it to a person. The reopening in 2023 created the opportunity to make that connection. Once Dawson's name emerged, detectives could begin examining his history through a completely different lens. They could determine where he had been. They could examine the circumstances under which his DNA had entered law enforcement databases. They could compare his known history with the chronology of the Hernandez case, and they could coordinate with investigators in other states who had encountered him. But again, the objective was not simply to build a frightening narrative around a suspect. The objective was to determine whether the evidence supported a charge in the death of Nancy Hernandez. That distinction became even more important because of the alleged connections to other sexual assault killings. Authorities said Dawson had been linked to cases in Panama City Beach, Florida, Seattle, Washington, and Denver, Colorado. Those cases potentially provided investigators with context, but context could never replace proof. Each jurisdiction had its own evidence, its own witnesses, its own legal proceeding. The Hernandez investigation had to survive independently, and yet the existence of those other cases made one question increasingly difficult to ignore. Had Nancy Hernandez's murder been part of a larger pattern of violence that investigators in 1992 could not see? If so, the passage of time had concealed not only the identity of her alleged killer, but also the possibility that her death belonged to a broader series of crimes. That possibility was disturbing, but detectives could not simply assume it. They had to follow the evidence wherever it led. The case now contained something it had lacked for 33 years, a suspect whose identity was supported by forensic evidence that changed the emotional landscape surrounding the investigation. For decades, Hernandez's death had represented an unanswered question. Families and communities often experience cold cases as a form of suspended time. There is no final courtroom moment, no official declaration that the person responsible has been held accountable. Instead, the victim remains connected to a crime without a conclusion. The case may become less visible, but the absence of an answer does not disappear. When an arrest finally comes, that suspended time begins to move again. But movement is not the same as closure. The warrant issued in January 2025 did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not bring Hernandez back. It did not automatically establish guilt. It created the possibility of a legal resolution, and that possibility depended on what investigators and prosecutors could prove. As the case moved through the legal process, the DNA evidence remained the central bridge connecting 1992 to the present. The biological material collected after Hernandez's death had survived long enough to produce a match. The match had produced a suspect. The suspect had become the subject of a warrant, and the warrant had transformed a forgotten cold case into an active criminal proceeding. But one question still stood above all the others. Could the evidence that had survived for 33 years survive the scrutiny of a courtroom? The answer would determine whether the story of Nancy Hernandez ended with an arrest or finally reached the point cold case investigators had been working toward from the beginning. Accountability supported by proof. For more than 3 decades, Nancy Hernandez's murder had existed without the one development that can transform an investigation from an unresolved tragedy into a criminal case, a person formally accused of responsibility. Now that person was Ricky Dawson, and the evidence connecting him to the case had come from a source investigators could not simply dismiss as an old rumor or a fading memory. It came from DNA preserved from the original sexual assault investigation, yet the appearance of a suspect did not suddenly make the case simple. In fact, it made every detail more important. The investigation had entered a stage where the question was no longer whether detectives could generate a lead. The question was whether that lead could survive scrutiny, whether the evidence could be placed into a coherent chain of events, and whether prosecutors could ultimately demonstrate that the person connected to the biological evidence was responsible for the death of Nancy Hernandez. That distinction is the difference between a cold case being cracked in the investigative sense and a homicide being proved in court. The DNA breakthrough had changed everything, but it had not changed the legal standard. Dawson remained an accused suspect, not a convicted murderer. The evidence still had to be tested through the justice system. For investigators, that meant returning to the forensic foundation of the case. The biological material had been collected after Hernandez was found dead in Hang Ah Alley on May 2nd, Sil, 1992. At the time, investigators could document the assault and preserve samples, but they could not attach a name to the genetic information. More than a decade later, Inspector Kervin Silas submitted the sexual assault evidence to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. The laboratory produced a DNA profile, but the profile initially remained unidentified. This was not a failure of science. It was the reality of forensic databases at the time. DNA could establish a genetic identity, but if there was no matching reference profile in an accessible database, the identity remained unknown. The evidence could tell investigators that a particular person had contributed biological material, but it could not tell them who that person was. That changed years later when the Hernandez case was reopened by the SFPD Homicide Cold Case Unit in October 2023. Investigators worked with the crime lab to revisit the evidence and compare the DNA profiles through code. The resulting match associated the profile with Dawson. A case that had been waiting since 1992 now had a name attached to its most important forensic clue. The significance of that moment extended beyond the laboratory. Detectives could now examine the suspect's history, his known locations, his criminal records, and his connections to other investigations. Authorities said Dawson was already incarcerated in Colorado and had been linked to other sexual assault homicide cases. That meant the San Francisco investigation was suddenly intersecting with a much larger law enforcement picture. Yet investigators could not allow the broader picture to overwhelm the specific case. Nancy Hernandez had to remain at the center. Her death had to be proved through evidence tied to her. Her medical examination, the original crime scene documentation, the sexual assault samples, and the DNA analysis were all pieces of a single evidentiary chain. Every link mattered. If one link was weak, the defense could attack it. If the chain was strong, the prosecution could argue that the evidence established responsibility. The first challenge was the passage of time. 33 years is an extraordinary gap in a homicide investigation. In 1992, investigators had questioned people while memories were fresh. By 2025, those memories could be dramatically different. A witness who once remembered a face might remember only a general impression. A person who once knew the neighborhood might no longer live there. A business that once stood near the alley might have disappeared. The physical environment itself could have changed. The investigation therefore depended increasingly on evidence that did not rely on human memory. That is one reason DNA is so powerful in cold cases. Human recollection deteriorates. Genetic evidence does not forget. A biological sample collected properly and preserved under appropriate conditions can retain information for decades. The evidence does not care how much time has passed. It remains what it was when it was collected. In the Hernandez case, that meant the forensic material from the 1992 examination could still speak in 2025. But DNA alone does not provide a complete narrative. Investigators had to determine what the profile meant within the circumstances of the crime. They had to understand the relationship between the biological evidence and the sexual assault documented by the medical examiner. They had to establish how the evidence had been collected, processed, stored, tested, and compared. These procedures might sound technical, even dull, compared with the dramatic language of a breaking news headline. But in court, technical details can become decisive. A jury does not simply hear that DNA matched. Jurors must understand what was tested, how it was tested, how strong the comparison is, and why the result matters. Prosecutors must explain the evidence in a way that survives cross-examination. Defense attorneys can challenge laboratory procedures, sample handling, statistical interpretation, and the circumstances surrounding the evidence. This is especially important in an investigation spanning several decades. The defense may ask whether the evidence was contaminated, whether records were properly maintained, or whether there is another explanation for the biological connection. Investigators, therefore, had to reconstruct the history of the evidence almost as carefully as they reconstructed the history of the crime. That reconstruction was part of the cold case process. A modern detective examining a 1992 homicide is not simply asking, who did it? The detective is also asking, what can we prove today that could not be proved then? In the Hernandez investigation, the answer was the DNA connection. The original investigators had physical evidence. Modern investigators had databases and advanced forensic analysis. The combination created an opportunity that did not exist in 1992, but the opportunity had to be handled carefully. The arrest warrant issued on January 2nd, SIL, 2025, marked an important legal step. Authorities sent the warrant to the Denver Sheriff's Office and placed a hold on Dawson. He was already incarcerated in Colorado, so the case did not require detectives to conduct a nationwide manhunt. But the fact that a suspect was already in custody did not eliminate the procedural requirements. San Francisco authorities still had to pursue the case through the appropriate legal channels. Dawson would have rights, prosecutors would have obligations, and the evidence would ultimately have to be evaluated in court. That is where the emotional force of a 33-year cold case collides with the discipline of criminal procedure. For relatives and community members, an arrest can feel like the end of uncertainty. For the legal system, it is the beginning of another stage. The accused must be treated as an accused person. Evidence must be disclosed and challenged. the prosecution must establish its case. A conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. None of those principles disappear because a homicide is old. None disappear because the victim's case has waited decades. If anything, the extraordinary age of the case makes the process even more important. Every conclusion must be supported by evidence that can survive scrutiny. That is also why investigators could not simply rely on Dawson's alleged history elsewhere. Authorities said he had been linked to other sexual assault homicides in Florida, Washington, and Colorado. Those connections could be relevant investigative context, but they did not prove the Hernandez homicide. Each allegation had to be evaluated independently. A person's involvement in one case does not automatically establish involvement in another. Investigators, therefore, had to keep their focus on the evidence connected to Hernandez. The strongest connection was the DNA. It was the piece of evidence that brought Dawson into the case after decades of anonymity. But detectives also needed to understand how the DNA fit the broader facts. The victim's injuries, the location, the sexual assault, the timing, the original investigation, the surviving documentation, the forensic examination, the database comparison, the arrest warrant. Each element had to form part of a coherent story, and the deeper investigators went, the more remarkable the timeline became. In 1992, Nancy Hernandez died in San Francisco and her killer remained unidentified. In 2005, biological evidence from the case was submitted for laboratory analysis. A DNA profile was developed, but it did not immediately identify anyone. In October 2023, the cold case investigation was formally reopened. The DNA evidence was revisited through modern systems. A match associated with Ricky Dawson emerged. In January 2025, an arrest warrant was issued. 33 years after Hernandez's death, the case had moved from an anonymous mystery to an active prosecution. Yet, even with that progression, the past continued to resist reconstruction. There were questions that DNA could not answer. Why was Hernandez targeted? What brought her and the attacker together? What happened in the moments before the assault? Was the attack planned or spontaneous? Did the killer know the area? Did anyone see the suspect before or after the crime? These questions might never receive complete answers. A DNA profile can identify a biological contributor, but it cannot resurrect every lost moment. That is one of the cruelest realities of cold cases. Technology can recover identities, but it cannot always recover memory. It can tell investigators who may have left biological evidence, but it cannot necessarily tell them why the crime occurred. It can bring a suspect back into the present, but it cannot undo the years that the victim's family spent without an answer. Still, the identification mattered. For 3 decades, the case had no named suspect. Now investigators had one. The biological evidence had transformed the investigation, and the arrest warrant demonstrated that authorities believed the evidence was strong enough to pursue formal action. The next challenge was the courtroom, where the emotional weight of 33 years would have no legal value unless converted into admissible evidence. The prosecution could not ask a judge or jury to convict because the case was old, because the victim deserved justice, or because the public was shocked by the delay. It had to prove the charge. That meant the DNA had to be presented correctly. The history of the evidence had to be established. The connection to Dawson had to be explained. The circumstances of Hernandez's death had to be proven, and the defense would have the opportunity to challenge every part of that chain. The case had traveled from a dark alley in Chinatown to a modern forensic database, then from a database to an arrest warrant. Now it was moving toward the place where cold cases faced their final test. Not the headlines, not public opinion, not the mystery surrounding a name, a courtroom. And there, 33 years after Nancy Hernandez was found dead, the question would no longer be whether investigators had finally found someone connected to the evidence. The question would be whether they could prove that connection was the truth of what happened to her. The case had crossed a line that cold case investigators rarely reach without years of frustration. The evidence had produced a name, the name had produced a warrant, and the warrant had transformed a 33-year-old homicide into a living criminal proceeding. But Nancy Hernandez's story was not becoming easy. It was becoming more consequential. Every piece of evidence collected in 1992 now carried the weight of time. Every forensic conclusion had to survive the question that follows every cold case breakthrough. Why should anyone believe this evidence? After so many years, the answer began with something investigators could not change. Nancy Hernandez had died on May 2nd, Sill, 1992. The medical examiner had documented the violence. The crime scene had been processed. Biological evidence had been collected. The case had been investigated. Nothing about the passage of time could erase those facts. What changed was the ability to connect the evidence to an individual. That connection led investigators to Ricky Dawson. But as the investigation moved forward, detectives had to resist the temptation to let the DNA answer every question. It could not. The forensic result was powerful because it gave investigators a specific person to investigate, but the homicide still required a complete evidentiary narrative. That meant looking beyond the laboratory and examining the man behind the profile. Dawson was already in custody in Colorado, meaning investigators did not have to locate him on the streets of San Francisco. His incarceration also meant that his movements and history could be examined through records that might not have existed in 1992. Detectives could study where he had lived, where he had traveled, what jurisdictions had previously encountered him, and how his DNA had entered the law enforcement system. The case was no longer an investigation into an unknown offender. It had become an investigation into whether one known individual could be connected to a specific crime committed more than 3 decades earlier. That distinction changed the nature of every question. In a contemporary investigation, detectives can often reconstruct a suspect's movements using digital records, surveillance footage, electronic transactions, communications, and other forms of information that did not exist in the same way in 1992. But the Hernandez homicide occurred before those systems became part of everyday life. There was no digital trail capable of simply illuminating the night. Investigators had to rely on the records that survived from the original investigation and whatever information could now be obtained about Dawson. The passage of time had created a strange imbalance. The victim as forensic evidence remained scientifically useful, while much of the surrounding human context had become increasingly difficult to recover. DNA could survive. Memory could not be guaranteed. Documents could remain in an archive. Witnesses could disappear. A photograph could preserve a crime scene forever, while a person who stood across the street that night might no longer remember what they saw. That is why cold case investigations often feel like a race between science and time. Science may become more powerful as the years pass, but human evidence generally becomes weak. The Hernandez investigation had benefited from the side of that equation that favors science. The biological evidence collected after the sexual assault had survived long enough to be analyzed and compared. The question now was whether the rest of the case could be reconstructed around it. Investigators knew that Hernandez had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The medical examiner determined that strangulation caused her death. Those findings provided a clear picture of the brutality involved, but they did not reveal motive. There was no simple explanation written into the forensic report. The evidence established what had been done to Hernandez, not necessarily why, and motive, while often important to investigators and prosecutors, is not always required to prove a homicide. A person can be convicted without prosecutors explaining every psychological reason behind a killing. Still, investigators naturally want to know, why Nancy Hernandez? Why that location? Why that night? Was she specifically targeted, or did the violence emerge from an encounter that escalated? Did the attacker know her? Was the assault connected to another criminal activity? These questions had existed since 1992, and the DNA match did not automatically answer them. It only narrowed the universe of possibilities. The man investigators now believed was connected to the biological evidence had his own history. Authorities said Dawson had been linked to other sexual assault homicides in multiple states. The geographic spread was striking. Panama City Beach, Seattle, Denver, San Francisco, different cities, different investigations, different years. The cases had their own facts and legal histories. Yet investigators now had a reason to examine whether the Hernandez homicide belonged within a larger pattern. That possibility could have enormous investigative value. Patterns can help detectives understand how a suspect may have operated, how he selected victims, how he traveled, or how he interacted with vulnerable people. But investigators also knew the danger of pattern-based assumptions. Similar crimes can look connected without actually being connected. A person can be accused in multiple cases and still require separate proof in each one. That meant the Hernandez investigation could not simply borrow conclusions from other jurisdictions. It had to establish its own evidence. The DNA was the critical starting point. It had connected Dawson to biological material recovered during the investigation. Now detectives needed to understand everything surrounding that connection. The process of forensic DNA comparison is technical, but its significance in this case was simple. Investigators had biological evidence from the original crime. They had a DNA profile. The profile had eventually been associated with Dawson through law enforcement databases. A 33-year-old unknown had become an identified suspect. That was the breakthrough, but it was also the moment when the case became vulnerable to scrutiny. Defense attorneys would have every reason to examine the forensic evidence in detail. How was the sample collected? How was it preserved? What laboratory procedures were used? What exactly did the DNA result demonstrate? Was the profile complete or partial? How statistically significant was the match? Were there alternative explanations? The public rarely sees these questions when a cold case arrest makes the news. Headlines compress decades of investigative work into a single sentence. DNA links prisoner to murder. Cold case solved. Suspect arrested. But behind those headlines are hours of laboratory work, legal review, records analysis, and questions that cannot be answered with a dramatic soundbite. The investigators working Nancy Hernandez's case had to build something more durable than a headline. They had to build a case. That process also required them to understand what the original detectives had done correctly. The work of Harry Walwyn and Ora Ginther, who investigated the homicide in 1992, became more important with every passing year. Their investigation had produced the evidence that modern detectives were now using. Had that evidence not been collected and preserved, there might have been nothing for the cold case unit to test decades later. This is one of the most overlooked elements of forensic breakthroughs. The technology may be new, but the evidence is often old. Modern investigators can only work with what earlier investigators preserved. The Hernandez case therefore became a story spanning generations of detectives. The original investigators confronted a violent homicide with the tools of 1992. Inspector Kervin Silas later submitted the sexual assault evidence to the crime lab in 2005. Years after that, the Homicide Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation in 2023. Different investigators, different technology, different eras, but one continuous case file. Each generation inherited what the previous one had left behind, and eventually the chain produced the result that had seemed impossible for so long: a DNA connection, a name, an arrest warrant. The January 2nd SIL 2025 warrant marked the point when the case became publicly visible again. Authorities sent the warrant to Denver, where Dawson was already being held. A hold was placed on him. For the first time in more than 3 decades, the state had taken a formal legal step against a specific person in connection with Hernandez's death. Yet the legal process remained only beginning. Dawson was entitled to contest the allegation. The prosecution would have to present evidence. The court would have to consider the charges according to law. The public might believe the mystery had been solved, but legally, the word solved required caution. A cold case can be considered solved by investigators when they identify a suspect and establish sufficient evidence to make an arrest. A criminal case is resolved only through the legal process. That distinction became increasingly important as Dawson's case moved forward. The Hernandez investigation had already survived the most difficult enemy of all. But time had also created new complications. The evidence had to be authenticated. Records had to be located. Investigators had to explain what had happened between 1992 and the eventual DNA match. Prosecutors had to demonstrate that the case had not simply been assembled around a convenient suspect after the fact. Every step had to connect. The evidence from the victim had to connect to the DNA. The DNA had to connect to Dawson. The circumstances of the crime had to support the interpretation of that connection, and the totality of the evidence had to support the charge. It was no longer enough to say that the case had a name. The case needed proof. Meanwhile, the community surrounding the original crime had continued to exist through all those years. Chinatown had changed, but the location of the homicide remained part of San Francisco's physical landscape. People who passed through Hang Aw Alley decades later might have known nothing about the woman whose life ended there. They might have walked through the area without ever hearing the name Nancy Hernandez. That is another haunting reality of old homicides. The physical world can continue after the crime, almost indifferent to it. Buildings remain, streets remain, businesses open and close. Thousands of people pass through the same spaces, but for the victim's story, one moment remains permanently fixed. May 2nd, Sill, 1992. The date of the killing, the date that transformed Nancy Hernandez from a living person into the center of an investigation. 33 years later, the investigation had returned to the public eye, yet there was still something missing. The DNA had supplied a connection, but the full story of the night remained incomplete. The investigation had identified a suspect, but it had not recovered every lost detail. The arrest warrant had created legal momentum, but it had not delivered a verdict. And the questions that had haunted the case for decades had not disappeared. They had simply become more focused. If Ricky Dawson was responsible, how did he come into Hernandez's life? What brought him to that alley? What happened in the moments leading up to the assault? And could the surviving evidence establish the sequence of events strongly enough to transform a decades-old forensic connection into a final judicial finding? The case had survived for 33 years because the evidence refused to disappear. Now it would have to survive something even more demanding: the scrutiny of the justice system. The cold case had reached a point where the silence of 33 years was finally being replaced by legal questions, and those questions were more difficult than the headlines suggest. For decades, Nancy Hernandez's death had been an unresolved homicide. Then the DNA evidence produced a connection to Ricky Dawson, and San Francisco authorities moved toward prosecution. But once a suspect is identified, the investigation changes character. Detectives are no longer searching blindly through an enormous universe of possibility. They are testing a specific theory against every surviving piece of evidence. Every fact that supports the theory matters. Every fact that contradicts it matters even more. And in a case that began in 1992, investigators had to perform that examination while knowing that much of the original world surrounding the murder had disappeared. The first challenge was chronology. A homicide is a sequence of events, even when investigators cannot reconstruct every moment. The victim was alive. An encounter occurred. Violence followed. The victim died. Evidence remained. The suspect, if identified, had to be connected to that sequence. DNA could establish an important biological connection, but investigators still had to place that connection within the timeline. The evidence collected during the sexual assault examination was not a random object discovered years later. It came from the investigation immediately following Hernandez's death. That fact gave it particular importance. The forensic material was connected directly to the medical examination performed after the killing when investigators were documenting the violence inflicted upon the victim. The medical examiner determined that Hernandez had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Her cause of death was strangulation. Those findings created the physical foundation of the homicide investigation. The DNA profile generated from the sexual assault evidence created the forensic foundation. When that profile eventually matched Dawson through CODIS, the two foundations began to intersect, but investigators still needed to understand how strong that intersection was. Cold case detectives are often forced to work backward in a new homicide. They start with the crime and move forward toward a suspect. In a case more than 30 years old, they may start with a suspect and move backward toward the crime, asking whether the available evidence can place that person inside the story. That was now the task facing investigators. Dawson was already incarcerated in Colorado. His criminal history was already known to law enforcement. Authorities said he had been linked to other sexual assault homicides, but none of those facts could substitute for the evidence in the Hernandez case. The detectives needed to keep asking the same question: what specifically connects Dawson to Nancy Hernandez? The DNA provided the most important answer, but investigators also had to examine the circumstances surrounding the evidence. They had to confirm the chain of custody. They had to understand the laboratory work. They had to establish that the profile had been generated from evidence associated with Hernandez's sexual assault. They had to determine how the database comparison was made and what it meant. These are the details that rarely appear in a dramatic headline, but often determine whether a cold case prosecution succeeds. A case can look overwhelming in public and still encounter serious challenges in court if the evidence is not properly documented. The Hernandez investigation therefore became an exercise in reconstruction. Detectives were rebuilding a case that had been created by another generation of investigators. They had to understand what had been collected in 1992. What had been tested in 2005, what had remained unidentified, and what changed when the case was reopened in 2023. The timeline itself told a remarkable story. In 1992, investigators collected the evidence. In 2005, the sexual assault evidence was submitted to the crime lab. The DNA profile remained without an identified suspect. Then, in October 2023, the Homicide Cold Case Unit formally reopened the investigation. Investigators revisited the forensic evidence and used CODIS to compare the available DNA profile. The profile was associated with Dawson. In January 2025, an arrest warrant was issued. A hold was placed through the Denver Sheriff's Office. 33 years of investigative uncertainty had been transformed into a formal accusation, but the case still had to move through the courts. The difference between accusation and proof was now impossible to ignore. Dawson was not convicted simply because the DNA pointed investigators toward him. He had legal rights, and the prosecution had the burden of proof. That is particularly important in a case that has attracted attention because of alleged connections to other homicides. Authorities said Dawson had been linked to sexual assault killings in Panama City Beach, Seattle, and Denver. Those cases may have influenced investigators' understanding of his background, but the Hernandez homicide remained a separate matter. The prosecution could not simply tell a jury that Dawson had been accused elsewhere and expect that to establish guilt in San Francisco. The evidence had to stand on its own. This is where the cold case investigation became less like a mystery story and more like forensic reconstruction. Detectives had to examine the old reports. They had to verify the original finding. They had to review the medical examiner's conclusions. They had to establish what the sexual assault evidence contained. They had to verify the laboratory results. They had to identify how the DNA profile was connected to Dawson. And they had to determine what additional evidence, if any, could strengthen that connection. Each step had a purpose. Each step reduced uncertainty. The investigation was not simply trying to answer who might have been involved. It was trying to build a chain of evidence strong enough to survive a legal challenge. The passage of time also made the emotional dimension of the case impossible to ignore. A homicide that remains unresolved for 3 decades does not exist only in police files. It exists in the memories of people connected to the victim. It exists in the community. It exists in the absence of an ending. For years, Nancy Hernandez's death had remained a story without a final chapter. There had been no courtroom confrontation, no conviction, no sentence, no judicial finding that the person responsible had been identified. Instead, there had been uncertainty. When the DNA match emerged, that uncertainty changed. But it did not vanish. An identified suspect can provide hope, but hope is not closure. Families can hear the word arrest and still know that the legal process has not finished. A warrant can create a sense of movement while leaving the ultimate question unanswered. The Hernandez case therefore entered a delicate period. Investigators had to communicate the breakthrough without overstating what the evidence had established. The public wanted certainty. The law demanded caution. The phrase cold case solved could suggest that a court had already decided what happened when, in reality, the investigation had produced a suspect and an evidentiary basis for prosecution. The distinction was not merely technical. It protected the integrity of the case. It also protected the rights of the accused. The legal system does not operate according to the emotional demand for a satisfying ending. It operates according to evidence and procedure. That meant the DNA evidence would be examined in a different environment now. In the laboratory, it could produce a profile and a comparison in court. That comparison would become subject to questions. Experts might be asked to explain the science. Defense attorneys could challenge the interpretation. Prosecutors would have to show why the evidence supported their case. Judges could determine what evidence was admissible, and ultimately, if a trial occurred, jurors would have to evaluate the evidence as a whole. That process can be frustrating to people who have waited decades, but it is precisely what separates justice from assumption. A cold case cannot be solved simply because investigators believe they have found the right person. It must be proved, and the Hernandez investigation was now moving toward that test. The most striking element remained the survival of the evidence. More than 30 years had passed since the sexual assault examination, yet the biological material had retained enough information to produce a forensic profile. That profile had remained useful even when it was anonymous. It waited until a matching record appeared. The match then connected the past to a man already in custody. It was an extraordinary demonstration of how forensic evidence can outlive the circumstances that created it. The person who collected the sample in 1992 could not have known how important it would become in 2025. The investigator who submitted it in 2005 could not know exactly when the profile would produce a name. The detectives who reopened the case in 2023 could not know whether their search would end in a match. Yet each stage depended on the previous one. The original investigators preserved the evidence. The crime lab converted the evidence into a DNA profile. The database provided the comparison. The cold case unit connected the result to an active investigation. The legal system then had to determine what that evidence meant. This chain is the real story behind many cold case breakthroughs. It is not one detective solving a mystery overnight. It is a succession of decisions made over decades, sometimes by people who never meet and never know that their work will eventually connect. In Hernandez's case, the chain remained intact, but the investigation still faced unanswered questions. The DNA could connect Dawson to the sexual assault evidence, but what about the rest of the crime? Could investigators reconstruct the circumstances strongly enough to establish that the same person was responsible for the beating and strangulation? Was there additional evidence preserved from the original scene? Were there witnesses whose information could still be recovered? Could Dawson's history help establish a timeline without improperly influencing the specific case? And most importantly, could the prosecution transform the forensic connection into proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions would shape the next stage of the case. The arrest warrant had opened the legal door, but what lay beyond it was uncertain. For the first time since 1992, Nancy Hernandez's homicide was no longer trapped in the past. It had entered the present, yet the present could not simply rewrite the past. Investigators had to prove what the evidence had preserved, not what people wished it had preserved. They had to distinguish between what was known and what remained unknown, and they had to accept that even after 33 years, some questions might never be answered. The goal was not to invent a perfect story. The goal was to establish the truth supported by evidence. That was the standard confronting the Hernandez investigation as it moved deeper into the legal process. The DNA had spoken after decades of silence. Now the evidence surrounding that DNA would have to speak as well. The longer investigators examined the Hernandez case, the clearer one truth became. The DNA breakthrough had not erased the mystery. It had concentrated it. For 33 years, the investigation had been defined by an unknown offender. Now there was a name, Ricky Dawson, and a forensic connection that authorities considered significant enough to seek an arrest warrant. But that development created a new burden. Investigators had to prove that the name belonged not merely in a database, but in the story of what happened to Nancy Hernandez. That meant confronting the evidence with a level of scrutiny that the case had never faced before. Every old report became important. Every forensic record mattered. Every surviving detail from the original investigation had to be reconsidered. The homicide had begun in 1992 as a crime scene. By 2025, it had become an archaeological investigation into the past. Detectives were digging through evidence created by another generation, trying to determine what could still be proven. The first and most important surviving fact was the condition in which Hernandez had been found. She had suffered severe violence. The medical examiner determined that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled, with strangulation identified as the cause of death. Those findings established the nature of the crime. They also explained why the sexual assault evidence was so important. The biological samples were not an unrelated forensic discovery. They had been collected as part of the examination of a woman whose body showed evidence of sexual violence. When that evidence eventually produced a DNA profile, the profile was directly connected to one of the central elements of the homicide investigation. For years, however, the profile remained anonymous. That anonymity was the defining problem of the case. Investigators had something scientifically valuable but operationally incomplete. They could test the evidence, but they could not name the person associated with it. The situation demonstrated a basic limitation of forensic science. Evidence can be extraordinarily precise and still be useless if there is nothing with which to compare it. A fingerprint without a database, a photograph without an identified face, a DNA profile without a matching reference. The information exists, but the identity remains hidden. That was the Hernandez case for years. Then the databases grew. Technology improved. The cold case unit reopened the investigation, and the profile finally produced a name. According to San Francisco authorities, that name was Ricky Dawson. The significance of the match was immediate, but detectives had to resist the urge to stop there. A database result is an investigative lead. It must be verified. The evidence must be reviewed. The circumstances must be established. The suspect must be connected to the specific crime. This process can be especially difficult when the suspect is already incarcerated for unrelated matters. Dawson was in Colorado, and authorities said he had been linked to other sexual assault homicide investigations. His existing incarceration meant investigators already had access to extensive records about him, but those records could create both opportunities and danger. On one hand, they could help establish his identity, movements, and criminal history. On the other hand, the existence of allegations or convictions elsewhere could create the temptation to interpret every unsolved crime through the same lens. Investigators had to avoid that trap. Nancy Hernandez's death required its own proof. Her homicide could not be solved merely by assembling a list of other cases associated with Dawson. The DNA connection was the central bridge. The rest of the investigation had to determine whether that bridge led directly to responsibility for the homicide. This was where the chronology of the case became critical. Hernandez died in 1992. The sexual assault evidence was collected at the time. In 2005, Inspector Kervin Silas submitted the evidence to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. A DNA profile was developed, but it did not initially identify a suspect. The investigation remained unresolved. Then, in October 2023, the Homicide Cold Case Unit reopened the case. The DNA evidence was revisited and compared through CODIS. The profile was associated with Dawson. On January 2nd, SIL 2025, San Francisco authorities issued an arrest warrant. A hold was placed through the Denver Sheriff's Office. The chronology showed something important. The suspect had not been selected first and then retroactively connected to the evidence. The forensic evidence existed before investigators knew his identity. That sequence strengthened the significance of the match because the DNA profile was not created after Dawson became a suspect. It was generated from evidence associated with the original crime. The match occurred later. This is one of the fundamental reasons DNA evidence can be so valuable in cold cases. The evidence does not need investigators to guess the identity of the offender first. The biological profile can exist independently, waiting for a matching reference to appear. That independence can make the evidence particularly compelling. But even compelling evidence must be interpreted carefully. Investigators still had to determine what the DNA demonstrated and what it did not. It demonstrated a biological connection to the evidence. It did not automatically reconstruct the entire crime. It did not reveal motive. It did not identify every person who may have been present. It did not necessarily explain how the assault unfolded. Those questions required additional investigation. The cold case team, therefore, had to look beyond the laboratory. They had to review the original police reports, the medical examiner's findings, and the records associated with the case. They had to understand the location. They had to revisit the circumstances in which Hernandez was discovered. They had to determine what evidence had been preserved and what information had been lost. Every surviving piece could potentially strengthen or weaken the theory. The passage of time also raised the issue of witnesses. In 1992, investigators may have interviewed people who had immediate knowledge of the area. Some may have seen unusual activity. Some may have known Hernandez. Others may have heard something without understanding its significance. 33 years later, the ability to rely on those memories was uncertain. Human memory is not a forensic database. It changes. Details can fade. Events can merge. People can remember the emotional impact of something while forgetting exact times or faces. That is why cold case investigations often depend on objective evidence preserved from the original event. The Hernandez case had such evidence. The DNA profile became the most important example. Yet investigators still had to determine whether other objective records could support the prosecution. The legal process demanded that distinction. A detective might be convinced by the overall picture. A prosecutor might believe the evidence supports a charge, but a jury must evaluate admissible evidence and decide whether guilt has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard does not become lower because the victim waited 33 years for justice. If anything, the age of the case makes the standard more important. The prosecution must explain why the evidence is reliable despite the passage of time. It must show that the DNA evidence was properly handled. It must demonstrate the integrity of the laboratory process. It must connect the biological evidence to the allegations against Dawson. It must also address any reasonable alternative interpretation. This is where the story of the Hernandez cold case moved from the realm of mystery into the realm of law. The mystery had been about identity. The law was about proof. The identity question had produced a powerful answer. The proof question was still unfolding. Meanwhile, the broader background surrounding Dawson continued to attract attention. Authorities said he had been linked to sexual assault homicides in Florida, Washington, and Colorado. The geographical spread was striking, but it remained important not to turn those allegations into automatic conclusions about the San Francisco case. Investigators could use information from other jurisdictions to understand a suspect's history and potentially identify additional evidence, but each allegation had to be independently established. This careful separation mattered because the Hernandez case was already compelling without relying on sensational assumption. A woman had been killed in 1992. Biological evidence had survived. A DNA profile had been generated more than 3 decades later. The profile had been connected to an identified man. A warrant had been issued. Those facts were enough to demonstrate the extraordinary movement of the case. There was no need to exaggerate what had not been proved. The most powerful part of the story was already in the evidence. The case also demonstrated how much of modern forensic investigation depends on patience. The DNA sample did not produce a name immediately. It took years. The cold case unit did not reopen the investigation until 2023. The warrant did not appear until 2025. At every stage, there was a period in which nothing seemed to happen to the public. Those years might look like silence. To investigators, they were part of the reality of unresolved homicide work. A cold case can require repeated testing, new databases, new technology, new personnel, and new investigative approaches before one old piece of evidence finally becomes useful. The Hernandez case was an example of that process. The breakthrough did not come from a newly discovered object. It came from an old piece of evidence that had finally found a match. That is what made the case so haunting. The answer had potentially existed in microscopic form since the night of the murder. The evidence did not need to be discovered. It needed to be recognized, and recognition came decades later. Yet even with the suspect identified, there was another question that could not be ignored. Why did the case remain unresolved for so long? Part of the answer was technological. DNA databases in 1992 could not perform the kind of nationwide comparisons that became possible later. Part of the answer was the simple reality of time. Witnesses disappear. Records become harder to locate. Investigators retire. Resources shift toward newer crimes. A homicide that lacks an identifiable suspect can slowly move down the list of active priority, but the existence of a cold case does not mean the victim stopped mattering. It means the available evidence was not enough to produce a legally sustainable identification at that time. Hernandez's case remained in that state until the forensic evidence and modern investigative resources finally converged. The convergence produced Dawson's name. It produced an arrest warrant. It produced renewed public attention, but it did not produce a verdict. That final distinction remained essential. At this stage, the correct description was not that a court had declared Dawson responsible, it was that authorities had identified him as a suspect and pursued charges based on the evidence available. The justice system still had to determine what that evidence meant. For Hernandez, the difference between accusation and conviction was more than a legal technicality. It represented the final distance between an investigation and closure. 33 years earlier, her death had created a question with no answer. Now the question had narrowed to one man, but the final answer still belonged to the court. The name that had been absent from Nancy Hernandez's case for more than 3 decades was now attached to a formal accusation, but the passage from suspicion to justice was still unfinished. For investigators, the DNA connection had been the breakthrough. For prosecutors, it was the beginning of a much harder task. They had to take evidence created in 1992, analyzed at different points over the following decades, and present it as a coherent chain that could withstand legal scrutiny. That meant the Hernandez case was entering its most demanding stage. The mystery had narrowed, but the burden of proof had become heavy. There was no longer a faceless, unknown offender. There was a specific defendant whose identity could be examined, whose history could be investigated, and whose connection to the evidence could be challenged. The case now had consequences not only for the victim and her community, but also for the accused man and the integrity of the criminal justice process. That is what makes the final stages of a cold case so different from the opening year. In 1992, detectives were searching for answers. Decades later, investigators had to prove the answers they believed they had found. The evidence began with Nancy Hernandez herself. She was 45 years old when she was killed. On May 2nd, SIL 1992, officers responded to Hang Aw Alley in San Francisco and found her severely injured. The medical examiner documented the violence. Hernandez had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Her death was ruled a homicide, with strangulation identified as the cause. Those findings established the seriousness of the crime from the beginning. There was no uncertainty about whether a violent act had occurred. The uncertainty concerned who was responsible. That question remained unanswered through the original investigation and for years afterward. Yet the investigators had preserved something that would ultimately become critical: evidence from the sexual assault examination. The samples were not collected with the knowledge that they would become the centerpiece of an investigation 30 years later. They were collected because investigators were documenting a crime. That distinction became one of the most important facts in the later prosecution. The evidence existed independently of Ricky Dawson. It was created before investigators knew his name. When Inspector Kervin Silas submitted the sexual assault evidence to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab in 2005, the objective was to see what forensic information could be extracted. A DNA profile was developed, but it did not immediately produce an identified suspect. The profile remained effectively anonymous. It could describe a biological contributor, but it could not name him. Then years passed again. The case remained unresolved. The DNA profile existed in the background, waiting for a comparison that had not yet arrived. When the Homicide Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation in October 2023, investigators had a new opportunity. The old evidence could be examined through modern systems, and the DNA could be compared through. That comparison produced the connection to Ricky Dawson. The importance of that sequence was enormous. The DNA did not become associated with Dawson because investigators first decided he was their suspect and then searched for evidence. Instead, the forensic profile existed first. The database comparison later associated it with him. That gave investigators a concrete reason to focus on Dawson, but even that powerful connection had to be examined carefully. The central question was no longer whether Dawson's DNA was associated with the forensic evidence. The question was what that association meant in the context of the homicide. The prosecution would need to explain the evidence clearly. It would need to establish the history of the samples. It would need to show how the laboratory reached its conclusions. It would need to connect the biological evidence to the sexual assault documented in Hernandez's medical examination, and it would need to establish why the evidence supported the allegation that Dawson was responsible for the homicide. The defense, in turn, would have the opportunity to challenge those conclusions. That is the nature of the adversarial legal system. Evidence is not simply presented and accepted because investigators believe in it. It is tested. Experts can be questioned. Procedures can be examined. Assumptions can be challenged. The prosecution has to demonstrate that the evidence is reliable and relevant. In a case that began 33 years earlier, the history of the evidence itself becomes part of the story. Investigators must show that the material tested today is the same material collected after the original crime. They must account for how it was stored and processed. They must explain the laboratory method. They must establish the connection between the DNA profile and Dawson. Every stage matters because the defense can examine any weakness in the chain. This is one reason cold case prosecutions can take years to develop. Even after a suspect has been identified, the arrest is visible. The preparation is not. The public sees a headline announcing that DNA has cracked a decades-old murder. Behind that headline, investigators and prosecutors may spend months or years reviewing evidence, verifying records, consulting forensic specialists, and preparing for challenges. The Hernandez case was no exception. The arrest warrant issued on January 2nd, SIL, 2025, was a major development, but it was not the final destination. Dawson was already incarcerated in Colorado, and San Francisco authorities placed a hold on him through the Denver Sheriff's Office. That meant the legal process could proceed without the dramatic image of detectives tracking a suspect across the country. Yet the absence of a manhunt did not make the case less significant. In some ways, it made the forensic breakthrough even more striking. Investigators did not have to chase an unknown person. They had to establish whether the evidence from a San Francisco homicide could be legally connected to a man already being held in another state. At the same time, Dawson's existing legal circumstances became part of the background. Authorities said he had been linked to other sexual assault homicide cases in Panama City Beach, Florida, Seattle, Washington, and Denver, Colorado. Those alleged connections immediately raised the possibility of a broader pattern. For investigators, that information could be useful. A suspect us movement and history can provide investigative leads. Other jurisdictions may possess records, forensic evidence, or witness information that could help reconstruct a person's activities, but there was a critical legal boundary. The Hernandez case could not be proved merely by pointing to other accusations. The prosecution had to establish the San Francisco homicide through evidence specific to Hernandez. That meant the DNA remained central. The other cases could provide context, but they could not replace the core evidence. This distinction became increasingly important as the case attracted public attention. A 33-year-old murder connected to a prisoner through DNA was already a powerful story. Add allegations involving other states, and the narrative becomes even more sensational. But the facts had to remain separated from speculation. The most responsible way to understand the case was to follow the evidence one step at a time. Nancy Hernandez was murdered. Sexual assault evidence was collected. A DNA profile was developed. The profile remained unidentified for years. The case was reopened. Investigators compared the profile through CODIS. The profile was associated with Dawson. Authorities obtained an arrest warrant. Those were the critical developments. Everything beyond them required proof. The investigation also demonstrated how dramatically the meaning of forensic evidence can change over time. In 1992, DNA evidence was already revolutionizing criminal investigations, but the databases and analytical capabilities of the modern era did not yet exist in their current form. A profile could be generated and stored, but a national comparison might not produce an immediate answer. In the following decades, law enforcement databases expanded. More offenders entered DNA systems. More unsolved cases were revisited. More agencies became capable of comparing evidence across jurisdictions. As that network grew, old evidence gained new potential. The Hernandez case became a perfect example of that principle. The biological evidence did not become stronger because it became old. It became more useful because the investigative environment around it changed. The evidence had been waiting for a match. Eventually, the match arrived. There was also something deeply unsettling about the idea that a person could remain unidentified for 33 years while the evidence capable of identifying him remained preserved. The delay was not necessarily a failure of the evidence. It was a limitation of the available information. In 1992, investigators did not have the comparison they needed. In 2005, the profile still had no identified match. In 2023, the case was reopened and the technology had changed. The past and present finally intersected. That intersection was the reason the case moved forward. But it also raised a difficult question about all the years in between. What might have happened if the technology had existed earlier? Would Hernandez's case have been solved within months instead of decades? Could her family have received answers sooner? Could another investigation have been different? Those questions cannot be answered with certainty. Case breakthroughs often create a painful awareness of what technology might have accomplished if it had existed at the time of the crime. Yet, investigators can only work with the tools available when they conduct the investigation. Their responsibility is to preserve what can be preserved and revisit it when new tools become available. That is exactly what happened here. The original investigators documented the crime. Later, investigators submitted the evidence for DNA testing. The cold case unit reopened the file. The database comparison produced a suspect. Each stage depended on the one before it. The investigation, therefore, became a chain spanning generations. No single detective could claim the entire breakthrough. The result came from the combined work of people separated by decades. That continuity also meant that the original victim remained present throughout the investigation. Nancy Hernandez was not simply a name generated by a database. Every forensic result traced back to a woman who had been alive in San Francisco in 1992 and whose life ended violently. The purpose of the investigation was not merely to identify DNA, it was to determine who was responsible for what had happened to her. That distinction gave the case its human weight. Technology could produce a match, but only a justice system could determine accountability. By this stage, the case had therefore reached an uncomfortable intersection between science, memory, and law. Science had produced the strongest new lead. Memory had become increasingly fragile because of time. Law now had to evaluate the evidence. The next stage would depend on whether investigators and prosecutors could turn the surviving fragments of a 33-year-old homicide into a case capable of answering the questions that had remained unanswered since 1992. The DNA had opened the door, but beyond that door was the part of the investigation no laboratory could perform alone. Reconstructing the crime, establishing the evidence, confronting the defense, and allowing the courts to decide what the evidence ultimately proved. For Nancy Hernandez, the wait had already lasted more than a generation. The investigation had finally moved, but movement was not yet closure. The name Ricky Dawson had entered the case. Now the legal system had to determine whether that name belonged at the end of the story. The silence surrounding Nancy Hernandez's death had finally been broken, but the first sound after 33 years was not a confession. It was a courtroom. In July 2026, Ricky Dawson was brought back to San Francisco to face the murder charge that had been waiting for him since the DNA breakthrough more than a year earlier. The man investigators had identified through forensic evidence was no longer simply a suspect being held in another state. He was now physically back in the city where Nancy Hernandez had been killed. More than 3 decades had passed since officers entered the narrow space near Hang Ah Alley and found Hernandez dead. The neighborhood had changed. The investigation had changed. The technology had changed. Even the man investigators believed was connected to the crime had changed with the passage of time. But the case number remained. The evidence remained, and now the courtroom had become the place where the surviving evidence would be tested. Dawson, 65 years old, had been serving a life sentence in Colorado in connection with a separate 1996 sexual assault murder. His return to California came only after that Colorado case reached its own conclusion. In March 2026, a Denver jury convicted Dawson of first-degree murder in the killing of Terry Turachak, and in April, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. That conviction was separate from the Hernandez case. It did not establish Dawson's guilt in San Francisco, but it meant that when California authorities finally moved forward, they were dealing with a man who was already serving a life sentence for another homicide. The legal history surrounding Dawson had become extensive, but prosecutors in San Francisco still had to prove their own case. The Hernandez charge stood on its own. The DNA evidence connecting Dawson to the sexual assault evidence was central, but the prosecution could not simply rely on his conviction in another state. The case had to return to May 2nd, SIL 1992, to the evidence connected specifically to Nancy Hernandez. That evidence began with the scene itself. Hernandez had been found inside a utility corridor near Hang Ah Alley in Chinatown. She was badly beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The forensic examination established that strangulation caused her death. The brutality was documented, but the identity of the offender remained unknown. The biological evidence collected during the sexual assault examination became the most important surviving clue. In 2005, those samples were submitted to the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. The resulting DNA profile did not immediately identify a suspect. The profile existed without a name. Then, years later, the Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation on October 11th, SIL 2023. Investigators returned to the case. They examined the DNA profiles and entered them into CODIS. The system produced a match associated with Dawson. That discovery led to the arrest warrant issued on January 2nd, SIL 2025. At that point, investigators believed they had finally identified the person connected to the evidence, but the legal system moved at a different speed. Dawson was already facing the Denver murder case, and California authorities had to wait. The warrant remained active. A hold was placed on him. The San Francisco case remained open, the evidence remained intact, and the clock continued to move. Then came the Colorado conviction. Dawson's legal situation changed again. He was no longer simply awaiting trial in Denver. He had been convicted and sentenced. That cleared the way for the next stage of the California case. The man whose DNA had connected him to a 33-year-old San Francisco homicide could now be transported back to the city. For investigators, it was the physical return of a case that had existed mostly on paper for decades. The suspect was coming back, but the victim could not. That fact remained the emotional center of the story. Nancy Hernandez had never had the opportunity to see the investigation reach this point. She had never heard the name of the person now accused in connection with her death. She had never seen the DNA evidence that would eventually become central to the case. She had never known that a sample collected after her death would survive for decades and eventually produce a match. The investigation had continued without her. That is the cruel reality of every cold case. The victim remains fixed in the past while the investigation moves forward through generations. In July 2026, that investigation finally entered a San Francisco courtroom. Prosecutors charged Dawson with murder along with special circumstances allegations involving a prior murder conviction, rape, and sodomy. Dawson was arraigned on July 20th and pleaded not guilty. His plea was a formal rejection of the charges, and legally the case remained unresolved. No verdict had been reached. No court had declared him guilty of Nancy Hernandez. A judge ordered him held without bail, and another court date was scheduled for July 30th. The language surrounding the case now had to become more precise than ever. For years, headlines could describe an unidentified killer. Then they could describe a suspect. Then a DNA match. Then an arrest warrant. Now there was an accused defendant standing before a court. Each stage carried a different legal meaning. The phrase cold case solved had become increasingly complicated. Investigators had solved an important part of the mystery by identifying a suspect. but the ultimate question of guilt remained for the legal system. This distinction was particularly important because the DNA evidence, while powerful, had to be presented within the full context of the case. Prosecutors alleged that biological evidence collected from Hernandez matched Dawson. That evidence had been preserved from the original investigation and later compared through code, but a jury would ultimately have to determine what the evidence established. The prosecution would have to explain the forensic testing. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge it. Experts could be questioned. The chain of custody could be examined. The circumstances of the evidence could be scrutinized. The age of the case could become an important issue. More than 30 years had passed between the crime and the prosecution. That enormous gap created questions that would not exist in a recent homicide. How had the evidence been stored? What records remained? Who handled the samples? What did the original investigation establish? Which witnesses were still available? Which memories had survived? These questions did not necessarily weaken the DNA evidence, but they demonstrated why a cold case prosecution requires more than a dramatic forensic discovery. It requires reconstruction. The prosecution must rebuild the case so that a judge and jury can understand what happened and why the evidence points toward the accused. The defense, meanwhile, has the right to examine every part of that reconstruction. The legal system cannot simply convert an investigative theory into a conviction. That process was now beginning in San Francisco. The courtroom was also the place where Dawson's broader history would have to be carefully separated from the Hernandez allegation. Authorities had linked him to several other sexual assault homicides. In Colorado, he had been convicted in the Turachak case. In Florida, he had a prior murder conviction involving sexual assault. Investigators had also connected his DNA to another unsolved Seattle homicide, although he had not been charged in that case. These facts created an alarming background, but the Hernandez prosecution still had to establish its own evidence. The danger of allowing other cases to dominate the narrative was obvious. A defendant's history can create a powerful impression, but a criminal conviction must rest on evidence relevant to the charge being tried. The San Francisco case was about Nancy Hernandez, her death, her injuries, the evidence collected from her examination, the DNA profile, the investigation that connected the profile to Dawson, the circumstances surrounding the homicide. Those were the questions that mattered most. The story had traveled a long distance to reach this point. It began in 1992 with a body discovered in a narrow San Francisco alley. It moved through an